Hey, everybody. Welcome to the watch event for the second hearing of this. Rob, I'm feeling more and more since Thursday, like this is just increasingly important. I don't know. Somehow that Thursday just really snuck into my brain and made me feel, like, hey, there's a lot going on here.
Yeah, absolutely. This feels like some of the, most significant congressional hearings we've ever had. Thinking about, Watergate hearings. You think about the Anita Hill hearings when Clarence Thomas was confirmed to the Supreme Court. The Brett Kavanaugh hearings. You know, like
Right.
I'm just thinking
Oliver
about
North.
yeah, Oliver North. That's a good one. Benghazi, though
I was going to say, do you feel like it's more like Benghazi for those of us on, that have an opinion that Benghazi was really just something overplayed by Republicans to try to harm Hillary Clinton? And the only reason we say that is because
Kevin McCarthy
Representative
admitted
Kevin
it.
McCarthy said that's what we did, and he bragged about it. That was their goal. I feel like this isn't so much that. I feel like it's more Watergate or Iran-Contra or something.
Yeah, that's what it feels like to me. It feels more like Watergate or Iran-Contra to me than it does Benghazi. Yeah, it's it. So I keep coming back, and one of the things I cannot shake from Thursday's hearing, it seemed like it was a throwaway statement. And I remember when she said it, I said, wait a minute, did she just say that?
Mm-hmm.
When Liz Cheney said that there were Congress people who requested a pardon from President Trump. That's really significant. Because I think it's very clear that Donald Trump is in a world of hurt from, just from the first hearing, like it's very clear that there is stuff here that, wow, this guy did some stuff wrong, and he lied and he acted in public in a way to thwart the election results knowingly, and they're going to talk all about that today. But the thing that was so interesting to me is like the broader impact of this and other elected officials who were involved, and who are the people who requested pardons.
Yeah.
And why did they think they needed pardons?
Right. Well, there's this great Buddhist teaching that you see the world as you are, not as it is, right? So it's a reflection that we all project onto the world, our own viewpoints. I think a lot of these congressmen, these MAGA congressmen, these insurrectionists supporting congresspeople, they're thinking, if it was me and we were in the majority and the Democrats had done the things that I did, I would put them in jail. I think that's what's going. I think there's so much of that with these guys and women that they just continue to make it clear their view of the world, which is that they would do horrible things. In fact, they have said it, right? They used to chant to have their political opponent, Donald Trump's political opponent, thrown in jail. Donald Trump promised that as one of his campaign promises for running for office. So I think these people are so convinced of what they would do that they're pretty sure that that's what the Democrats are going to do. And as soon as this insurrection happened, they thought, I have serious legal liability. And so I think that's what's going on. So I don't think it's just that they feel guilty. I think it's that they feel guilty and they're like, oh, if it were me, I would put me in jail.
Yeah. And so Brandon Pfeiffer says in the comments, I don't know that. Do you know that guy, Brandon Pfeiffer? He says in the comments, name them.
Let's go.
And I'm curious, Doug, if you think, oh my goodness, look at that face in that profile picture. I'm curious if you think, when will they be named? Will they be named? I mean, it's going to come out. Will it come out?
Yeah, they're going to name them.
Will it come out?
Say their name. Say their name. Say their name.
Will it come out in a committee hearing, or will it be leaked to the press?
Oh, it's going to come out in a committee hearing for sure. They're going to wait. They're going to hold that thing tight. I think they're going to hold it tight, and they're going to unleash.
And if it's Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz, can Jamie Raskin be the one to name them?
Yeah, you just want this is the professional wrestling side of politics, isn't it? That you just want the WWF. Yeah, look,
because
I think it's Jim. I think it's Jim Jordan too. I really am pretty well convinced that it's Jim Jordan, and then it's because I don't even know that Marjorie Taylor Greene and Gates or Cawthorn had enough power to pull stuff off. But Jim Jordan, on the other hand, was speaking to Trump every day by his own admission. He couldn't remember if he spoke to him during the insurrection. Couldn't recall. He speaks to him a lot. He couldn't quite remember if he spoke to him. So that guy is.
Jim Jordan. Right. That would be fantastic if it's Jim Jordan. I also think Madison Cawthorn spoke at the Stop the Steal rally that incited the it was kind of the starting point for the riot. I think the riot was less incited and more planned. To use the word incited makes it sound like they just got riled up and lost their minds. The reality is this thing was planned. And Doug, have you seen the thoughts that Marjorie Taylor Greene was the person who planted the pipe bombs?
No, come on. Seriously? That's one of the notions that Marjorie Taylor Greene is out there digging around in the bushes carrying a backpack?
Yeah.
No, I have not. There's not much I wouldn't believe that they would do, but I do find that a bit of a stretch.
I'll have to send some analysis to you, and we can go over it and decide if we want to go.
Is it because of the video? Is it because the way the person looks in the photos? Is that like they've overlaid her body shape or stance or walking gait?
Her gait and everything. Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
And I was reading a very long Twitter thread this week from Dr. Jack Brown, who's a great Twitter follow for those of you on Twitter. He is a body language expert and often does body language analysis of major events that are taking place, and it's absolutely fantastic stuff. And he did an analysis of an interview that Donald Trump did with Candace Owens, in which it's his assessment that Trump was very insistent on using the masculine pronouns to describe the pipe bomber, and in a way that, through this body language analysis was completely dishonest, that Trump knew it was a woman and not a man. And
holy moly.
And therefore, it's good stuff.
Well, no,
I'm not a conspiracy theorist.
No, you're not. You're just pro. Yeah, but there are no accidents. Is that what your man Steve Bannon says? There are no coincidences.
My man, Steve Bannon.
Yeah, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, he says, but there are no coincidences. Just unbelievable. Well, look, I know people are saying that they're not watching this, and I'm sure today, the viewership is going to decline. And I know that, so we should make it the news clear for people who don't know that one of the scheduled witnesses, person who worked in Trump's campaign, and is a chief principal in the campaign, was going to testify today and had to reschedule that or say I can't make it because of a family emergency for which he was.
His wife went into labor.
Oh, I bet. He was. Where was I going with that? So that's that I think is the reason. And now they're having to get his video testimony from the hearings together to be able to show. That's why they're late in starting this thing. It was supposed to start at 10 a.m. Eastern time, 9 Central. That's 8 in the Mountain time, and 6 a.m. or 7 a.m. on the West Coast. They're starting late. And this is the kind of stuff, they didn't do this on Thursday, right? They made sure the thing started at 8 p.m. and finished by 10 p.m. Eastern time because it was prime time. Now it's daytime programming. It's okay to start late. This is the kind of thing that causes people not to watch. They were going to watch a half an hour ago, and then things didn't start, and then or they blocked off a certain period of time, and then they can't watch it. This is what I hope they don't do. If they're going to say to the American people, this really matters and we all need to be paying attention to it and we need to keep ourselves focused on it, then start the thing on time. I mean, I know that meetings like this happens, but with Congress or with press conferences, with every administration that I have followed since, the Jimmy Carter administration, they do this stuff. They just come late, and it drives me bonkers. In fact, a lot of people don't want to say anything positive about the George W. Bush administration, but one of the things they did, they were prompt, and they prided themselves on their promptness. Sure, they may have, used deceptive information in order to invade another country and destabilize the Middle East, but they did it timely. When they had those press conferences, they said, we're starting at 8. They started at 8. I appreciate that from anyone who's willing to start these things on time. And I know there's reasons that they all can't get there, but it just sends a message that to the American people who have scheduled their live streams that, they're not quite ready. Yeah. And I get it if something big happened and somebody went into labor and everything else. But here's the thing. Live TV happens all day. In fact, turn on multiple cable channels. People go into labor. Things happen. You reschedule guests. You have people work this stuff out. I'm unsympathetic to starting late. Let me just make that point. So anybody else that's equally as frustrated, you got a friend in me.
You done? You good?
Nah, I don't know. Maybe.
Yeah. So 20 million people tuned in on Thursday night. 20 million. That is football game viewership.
Oh, wow. It's almost as important as football.
No, I'm saying like,
wow, that's a lot.
For
20 million.
Republicans who want to say this is no big deal. There's nothing, there's no there, nothing to see here, blah, 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 blah. The American people thought very differently. Donald Trump, who loves to brag about ratings and big crowds, 20 million people tuned in. Ratings were huge for this event.
Huge. And it tells you something. And they were, and I'm guessing that they are smart enough in their calculations of this to include people like us that are watching it on YouTube, people that are watching it on network television, people watching it on cable. I'm sure they've got, they're grabbing all this. Yeah. But there's 350 million people in this country. There's 200 million of those who are of age where they could watch and understand this. There were 150 million people who voted in the election in 2020, the presidential election, the largest number of people to ever vote. 20 million? Yeah, it's a lot. But when you put it into scale of 150 million people voting, 300 million people in the 300 million people plus, it's a lot. I mean, it's a small fraction because that's a big number. So I feel less. You kind of hope that all those 20 million are then talking about it to somebody and amplifying it. Getting it to 40 million people know about it, maybe, or got some of the detail. Do you feel that way at all? That it's a big number for like how many people watch fill in the blank television show or something. But I think like the Super Bowl got 100 million people, doesn't it? Isn't that? Do I remember that right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, we got a ways to go, but it's.
But share this feed with your friends. People, do your part.
Exactly.
And please subscribe if you haven't already. I mean.
Yeah. So just to circle back, I've got on my iPad right in front of me here. I'm following the Twitter feed because I feel like events like this are best shared on Twitter. This is what Twitter is for.
This is what Twitter is
moments
for.
like
the Twitter
this.
bots are ready to go.
It's moments like this when some of the national attention is focused on one thing. When Will Smith slaps Chris Rock, that's a moment made for Twitter. When, I mean, just imagine if, if the wardrobe malfunction had, with speaking of Super Bowls, had happened in the age of Twitter. Like the Twitter is made for moments like this. And so I'm following the Twitter, and we ask in Twitter answers. This is a NPR article that committee members say those who sought pardons will be revealed later. Representative Elaine Luria of Virginia, a member of the January 6th panel, said information revealing which members of Congress sought pardons would be discussed in upcoming hearings. So
that's magical.
Jamie Raskins, Democrat from Maryland, another member of the committee, also would not identify which members sought pardons and how many of them did. But I can't wait until he does. Asked by Dana Bash on State of the Union, he said, yeah, well, the seeking of pardons is a powerful demonstration of the consciousness of guilt, or at least the consciousness that you may be in trouble. And that's what's so shocking about this. It's not just one.
Because when
multiple
you seek a
members
pardon,
of Congress,
in order to receive even a presidential pardon, or if for the crimes, if it's a gubernatorial pardon, there's a demand for an admission of guilt, right? So like even if Donald Trump is brought up on charges by the Justice Department for his actions in lying to the American people and defrauding the American people and participating in an insurrection, if that were to happen and then Joe Biden were to pardon him, which is something I think should happen. I despise the man, Donald Trump. Yep. I think he is a criminal. I think he's run a criminal conspiracy in his business and in the presidency and all that. We just can't have presidents in federal prison. It's a consequence of an election of a president. They're not above the law, but we also just can't be treating them as if, because that will open up a can of trouble on this country that's just unfathomable. So like happened with Richard Nixon, that he was then pardoned. In order for Nixon to have accepted the pardon, he had to admit the guilt that he was going to be charged with, that he was then pardoned from. So Trump would have to admit his guilt if he were to be pardoned, or any of these other people, if they were to have received a pardon, they were prepared to admit their guilt. Some people think that a pardon sort of means that it's like a timeout, or it gets called off, or everything gets removed. It doesn't. It means you're guilty of what you're charged with, and the consequence for that guilt is removed from you.
Yeah.
Not that you're not guilty or there's something else. So these pardons, when someone seeks them, this is why they're saying that it's a big admission of guilt, because it is the admission that you did something.
Yeah. It feels like we are close to getting started. I have this just kind of seeing what's happening in the committee room. So I real quick want to respond to something that Alex said in the comments, and I encourage everybody. We'd love to hear your comments as we go along today.
You say hello.
And please subscribe when you comment as well. Either Trump knew he lost and intended on overturning the election, or he's delusional thinking he won and there was a conspiracy against him. Either way, he should never hold office again. This is a great comment. It's the crux of, we talked about this a bit on Thursday. This seems to be the crux of the Republican the argument of the committee. This seems to be what Liz Cheney was going at specifically on Thursday. The committee is making the argument that Trump was not delusional, that Trump knew that he lost and was purposefully lying about it in an attempt to overturn the election. It's not like the committee is saying, listen, this isn't just like, hopeful political rhetoric of like, yeah, I'm trying to gin up my supporters.
Yeah.
I think we can do it. No. What Donald Trump did is he knew he had lost, and so he fraudulently fraudulently, and and uh, and as Marjorie Taylor Greene would say, fragrantly. Did you see that clip? So great.
I did. I saw you said that too.
Um, incited the public to violence based on things that he knew were not true, lies.
Yes. And then
And
did
so,
nothing about it when that violence started, which I think is part of the storyline here, is that we know he was supportive of the violence because he didn't do anything to stop it.
yeah. Now, Doug, you've been in the camp of he really thinks he won.
Yes, that he's delusional.
Yeah.
His mind,
So
his mind is so warped that he actually
the
believes
committee is going to have to convince you otherwise, huh?
The committee's going to have to make the point, and this is a point that can be made in any of these things, and there's a legal term for it, and I don't remember it, but the term is something like any person of good will or good faith should have known. So you can deceive yourself about something that you didn't think was happening or was going to happen, but if reasonable people would say you should know, then you're culpable. So it's possible that both things can exist, that Donald Trump had so convinced himself and only brought around him. I think he's been delusional through his entire presidency. I think he believed the stuff about COVID just going away. I think he believed he had the largest crowds. I think he believed all of his own rhetoric about this stuff because he's trained up his mind over years, and he's written about this and talked about this, of how you just create an alternative reality and live into that alternative reality. He's a true reality TV sort of person, even though he was terrible on the show. So it's possible, I think likely, that he really did convince himself of this. But legal culpability says he shouldn't have, and he's still culpable even though he convinced himself that this was the case. Sometimes people will go as far, if it's some other kind of a crime, is to claim mental instability or what you would call insanity, right? That the person just had lost touch. But if someone's like, hey, I stole money from a bank because I believe that that was my money. And you're like, I think you really do believe that's your money, but the money in the bank that's not in your account is not yours. Yeah, but I truly believe that it is. Well, you don't get to believe that. You're still guilty of it, even though you really believe it was yours. There's this line that happens legally, and that's the rail. So when I say, look, I think Donald Trump really did believe it, does not mean that he's not culpable of the actions that led to the insurrection or the continued financial fraud that is going on. All right, you talk for a minute. I'm going to change the screen over here, which is over on this magical side of my little setup here.
Okay.
So because I want to.
Yeah. So that really becomes, the crux of all of this, and I'm really interested to see, what the committee is able to prove today. If you remember, Liz Cheney kind of laid out in her testimony, which, by the way, I got a message.
Oh.
From
Dick,
a family member.
Oh, of yours or of hers?
Of mine,
Oh.
Not of Liz Cheney's. Of a family member of mine, a woman, say more of an elder woman, who said got a bit of a crush on Liz Cheney after watching the hearings. So, Liz Cheney is compelling the American public, which is great. So Liz Cheney laid out, here's, essentially kind of what we're going to be talking about in each of these committee hearings. And this one is designed to show that Donald Trump lied, that he fraudulently knew that he lost the election, and then sought to overturn the results of that. And then we're going to see how that impacted the Justice Department and Attorney General Barr. We're going to see how that impacted, what was the second group? The Vice President. And then the third group is state legislators, which Ginny Thomas, coming for you, Ginny. Coming for you, Ginny.
Yeah, you're speaking of Supreme Court Justice Thomas's wife, who was trying to impact state legislatures. And
Yeah. Yeah. The wife of a sitting Supreme Court justice emailing 29 state legislative officials, urging them to appoint false, fake electors as opposed to those.
You remember in Watergate, the catchy phrase became, "What did he know and when did he know it?" Right. In the Clinton impeachment legal proceedings, it depends on what the definition of is to the question, is there a relationship between you and Monica Lewinsky? These little catchphrases tell you something about what was going on, right? What did he know and when did he know it? This one, I think, is going to come down to something like, what did Trump believe and should he have believed it? I think that's going to be somebody will come up with a better phrase than that, but that's going to be the functional question here. What did Trump believe about the election and should he have believed that? I think that's the direction that the committee is going to push for.
Yeah. And just, since we've mentioned Watergate a couple of times, last night was the season finale of Gaslit on Starz, story of Martha Mitchell and her involvement in everything that happened with Watergate. Traces John Dean and G. Gordon Liddy and John Mitchell and all of them through the Watergate thing. Sean Penn as John Mitchell. You'll never recognize him. Julia Roberts as Martha Mitchell. Wow, what a great show.
Stayed solid all the way through?
It did. Really great. Really, really great. Highly recommend it.
Okay, 2 thumbs up. I'm going to be pushing myself pushing that on our television box too.
As our friend Britton would say, 5 tacos.
Oh, 5 tacos. That's cute. Hey, did you see that little meme that was going around? It's a list of all the things that is required of someone to sell tacos from a taco truck in Texas.
Yes.
And then a list of things for an 18-year-old to buy an AR-15. It was about as powerful of a taco-related political statement that I have ever seen. I've had 2 tacos since I saw that. You mentioning tacos now, and that meme pops up into my head. I wish I had it right now. I'd put it up on the screen. But Google that taco selling requirements versus gun buying requirements in the state of Texas. It's stunning.
Yeah, Brandon Pfeiffer, who apparently comments a lot. And, apparently has nothing better to do with his life than to, sit here and watch this with us.
There is nothing better to do with one's life than to sit here with us.
And certainly Brandon, of all people, has nothing better to do.
This is glorious.
I would assume. I'm just going to use this stream as an opportunity to insult Brandon. He has a quote here.
I think it's a bit of a self-insult too, but that's fair enough. Yeah, it's the best.
Well, I'm performing a public service.
It's the best kind.
Yeah. Day 1 was about criminal act. Today is about displaying the criminal mindset. So that's really, it gets to the crux of what we're talking about.
All right. Well, 46 minutes after they said they were going to start this hearing,
and 16 minutes after they said they were going to start this hearing.
Here they are. I mean, has that baby been born? Can Seppian come back over now because they waited long enough? Is that what they were doing? They're just stalling this thing out. Took so long that labor was done. All right, so here we go. We're going to pop them on, and sometimes we're going to comment during this. And if you don't want to hear us commenting, please don't tell us not to comment.
Because that's what we're going to do.
Watch somewhere else.
No, don't watch somewhere else. Just be annoyed with us. Are we going to hear from more than Benny Thompson and Liz Cheney?
I hope so.
Mm-hmm.
I hope we're going to hear anything at all. So let me get over here and do magic to make the sound come out. All right, I think the sound should be working now. We've got a lot of things happening on this end of life over here, friends. So,
Producer Dan isn't here to help, huh?
No. Out of office all week.
The Select Committee to investigate
you
the
hearing
January
that, Rob?
6th attack
I am.
on the United States Capitol will be in order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the committee in recess at any point. Pursuant to House Deposition Authority Regulation 10, the chair
not a
announces the
teleprompter.
committee's
It's a
approval
screen
to
down there
release
on
the
the floor that he's
deposition
reading off
material
of.
presented during today's hearing.
You can see.
Good
I
morning.
wondered about this. They'll glance
Last
away
week,
from it.
the Select Committee laid out a preview of our initial findings about the conspiracy overseen and directed by Donald Trump to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election and block the transfer of power, a scheme unprecedented in American history. My colleagues and I don't want to spend time talking about ourselves during these hearings, but as someone who's run for office a few times, I can tell you at the end of a campaign, it all comes down to the numbers. The numbers tell you the winner and the loser. For the most part, the numbers don't lie. But if something doesn't add up with the numbers, you go to court to get resolution. And that's the end of the line. We accept those results. That's what it means to respect the rule of law. That's what it means to seek elective office in our democracy. Because those numbers aren't just numbers, they're votes. They're your votes. They are the will and the voice of the people. And the very least we should expect from any person seeking a position of public trust is the acceptance of the will of the people, win or lose. Donald Trump didn't. He didn't have the numbers. He went to court.
My favorite.
He still didn't have
Great
the numbers.
speaking style.
He lost. But he betrayed the trust of the American people. He ignored the will of the voters. He lied to his supporters and the country. And he tried to remain in office after the people had voted him out, and the courts upheld the will of the people. This morning, we'll tell the story of how Donald Trump lost an election and knew he lost an election, and as a result of his loss, decided to wage an attack on our democracy, an attack on the American people by trying to rob you of your voice in our democracy, and in doing so, lit the fuse that led to the horrific violence of January 6th, when a mob of his supporters stormed the Capitol sent by Donald Trump to stop the transfer of power. Today, my colleague from California, Ms. Lofgren, and our witnesses will detail the Select Committee's findings on these matters. But first, I will recognize our distinguished Vice Chair,
it's at
Ms.
your house,
Cheney
Rob.
of Wyoming, for any opening statement she'd care to offer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Last week, as the chairman noted, our committee began outlining a 7-part plan overseen by President Trump to overturn the 2020 election. Today, we will begin looking at the initial part of that plan. President Trump's effort to convince millions of Americans that the election was stolen from him by overwhelming fraud.
The gas
Federal
station
court
coffee
has
cup.
already reviewed elements of the committee's evidence on this point and said this, quote, "In the months following the election, numerous credible sources from the president's inner circle to agency leadership and statisticians informed President Trump and Dr. Eastman that there was no evidence of election fraud," close quote, sufficient to overturn the 2020 presidential election. The court's opinion methodically documents each of the principal reasons for that conclusion, and I would urge all those watching to read it. Today, we will begin to show the American people some of our evidence. Today, you will hear much more from former Attorney General Bill Barr's recorded testimony, and you will hear in greater detail what others in the department told President Trump, that his claims of election fraud were nonsense. You will also hear much more from President Trump's own campaign experts, who had also concluded that his fraud claims could not be supported. Let me focus briefly on just 3 points now. First, you will hear firsthand testimony that the president's campaign advisors urged him to await the counting of votes and not to declare victory on election night. The president understood even before the election that many more Biden voters had voted by mail because President Trump ignored the advice of his campaign experts and told his supporters only to vote in person. Donald Trump knew before the election that the counting of those mail-in ballots in several states would not begin until late in the day and would not be complete for multiple days. This was expected, reported, and widely known. You will also hear testimony that President Trump rejected the advice of his campaign experts on election night and instead followed the course recommended by an apparently inebriated Rudy Giuliani to just claim he won and insist that the vote counting stop,
I hope that's true.
to falsely claim everything was fraudulent. He falsely told the American people that the election was not legitimate. In his words, quote, a major fraud. Millions of Americans believed him. Second, pay attention to what Donald Trump and his legal team said repeatedly about Dominion voting machines. Far-flung conspiracies with a deceased Venezuelan communist allegedly pulling the strings. This was, quote, complete nonsense, as Bill Barr said. President Trump's own campaign advisors, his Department of Justice, and his cybersecurity experts all told him the same thing. Here, for example, is White House lawyer Eric Hirschman. His view was shared by many of the Trump team whom we interviewed.
I thought the Dominion stuff I never saw any evidence whatsoever to sustain those allegations.
And third, as Mike Pence's staff started to get a sense for what Donald Trump had planned for January 6th, they called the campaign experts to give them a briefing on election fraud and all the other election claims. On January 2nd, the general counsel of the Trump campaign, Matthew Morgan, this is the campaign's chief lawyer, summarized what the campaign had concluded weeks earlier, that none of the arguments about fraud or anything else could actually change the outcome of the election.
Generally discussed on that topic was whether the fraud, maladministration, abuse, or irregularities, if aggregated and read most favorably to the campaign, would that be outcome determinative? And I think everyone's assessment in the room, at least amongst the staff, Mark Short, myself, and Greg Jacob, was that it was not sufficient to be outcome determinative.
As is obvious, this was before the attack on the Capitol. The Trump campaign legal team knew there was no legitimate argument, fraud, irregularities, or anything to overturn the election. And yet President Trump went ahead with his plans for January 6th anyway. Mr. Chairman, hundreds of our countrymen have faced criminal charges. Many are serving criminal sentences because they believed what Donald Trump said about the election, and they acted on it. They came to Washington, D.C. at his request. They marched on the Capitol at his request. And hundreds of them besieged and invaded the building at the heart of our constitutional republic. As one conservative editorial board put it recently, quote, Mr. Trump betrayed his supporters by conning them on January 6th, and he is still doing it. Another conservative editorial board that has long supported President Trump said last week, Donald Trump, quote, won't stop insisting that 2020 was stolen, even though he has offered no proof that that is true. And this, Donald Trump now, quote, clings to more fantastical theories, such as Dinesh D'Souza's debunked 2,000 mules, even as recounts in Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin confirm Trump lost.
Yep.
Those are the correct conclusions to draw from the evidence gathered by this committee. We have much more evidence to show the American people on this point than we can reasonably show in one hearing. But today, we will begin. Thank you,
Play it
Mr.
on a
Chairman.
loop.
I yield back.
Play it on a loop. You can start a YouTube channel and just let it run over and
Without
over and over.
objection, the chair
Apparently
recognizes the
inebriated
gentlewoman from California,
Rudy
Ms.
Giuliani.
Lofgren, for an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. In our opening hearing, we gave an overview of our investigation into the January 6th attack. The plot to overthrow the election was complex and had many parts, which we'll explore in remaining hearings. But today, we examine the false narrative that the 2020 election was, quote, stolen. Former President Trump's plan to overturn the election relied on a sustained effort to deceive millions of Americans with knowingly false claims of election fraud. All elements of the plot relied on convincing his supporters about these false claims. Today, we'll demonstrate the 2020 election was not stolen. The American people elected President Joe Biden. We'll present evidence that Mr. Trump's claims of election fraud were false, that he and his closest advisors knew those claims were false, but they continued to peddle them anyway, right up until the moments before a mob of Trump supporters attacked the Capitol. We'll also show that the Trump campaign used these false claims of election fraud to raise hundreds of millions of dollars from supporters who were told their donations were for the legal fight in the courts.
Yeah.
But the Trump campaign didn't use the money for that. The big lie was also a big ripoff. The former president laid the groundwork for these false claims well in advance of the election. As early as April 2020, Mr. Trump claimed that the only way he could lose an election would be as a result of fraud.
Yeah.
Rudy Giuliani is number one trending on Twitter
bundling
right
and
now.
all of the things that are happening with votes by mail, where thousands of votes are gathered, and I'm not going to
April
say
8th.
which party does it, but thousands of votes are gathered and they come in and they're dumped in a location, and then all of a sudden you lose elections that you think you're going to win.
The only way we're going to lose this election is if the election is rigged. Remember that. It's the only way we're going to lose this election.
This is going to be a fraud like you've never seen. Did you see what's going on? Take a look at West Virginia, mailmen selling the ballots. They're being sold. They're being dumped in rivers. This is a horrible thing for our country. This is not going to end well.
No, it's not going to end well.
Mr. Trump decided
For
even
you.
before the election that regardless of the facts and the truth, if he lost the election, he would claim it was rigged. Mr. Trump was right about one thing. It did not end well.
There you
On
go.
election night, Mr. Trump claimed even before the votes were counted that his loss was a result of fraud. Now, Thursday, we had testimony from Attorney General Barr about the Department of Justice investigation of Mr. Trump's fraud claims. Barr told Trump directly that his claims were BS. Yet, after hearing the truth and that warning from the AG, Mr. Trump continued to peddle the false claims of fraud. You'll hear detailed testimony from Attorney General Barr describing the various election fraud claims the Department of Justice investigated. He'll tell you how he told Mr. Trump repeatedly that there was no merit to those claims. Mr. Barr will tell us that Mr. Trump's election night claims of fraud were made without regard to the truth and before it was even possible to look for evidence of fraud. Attorney General Barr wasn't alone. You'll see and hear today other Department of Justice officials and senior advisors to Mr. Trump that they told him the claims he was making were not supported by evidence. The election fraud claims were false. Mr. Trump's closest advisors knew it. Mr. Trump knew it. That didn't stop him from pushing the false claims and urging his supporters to, quote, fight like hell, to, quote, take back their country. After he lost the election, various legal challenges were made. You'll hear testimony today from a renowned Republican election litigation lawyer who will explain the normal process by which candidates challenge an election. Rather than accept the results of the election and the decisions of the courts, Mr. Trump pursued a different strategy. He tried to convince the American people the election had been stolen. Many of his supporters believed him, and many still believe him today. The attack on January 6th was a direct and predictable result of Mr. Trump's decision to use false claims of election fraud to overturn the election and to cling to power. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. I now welcome our first witness. We're joined today by former Fox News politics editor Chris Stilwell, Bill Stepien President Trump's former campaign manager, was subpoenaed to be here and was in Washington this morning, prepared to testify. Kevin Marino, Mr. Stepien's attorney, is here with us today. Thank you, Mr. Marino, for coming. And he has advised us that Mr. Stepien's wife went into labor this morning. Mr. Stepien unexpectedly had to travel to be with his wife, and we wish him the best.
Yeah, hope she's doing okay.
Due to the depth and rigor of our investigation, we have several hours of Mr. Stepien's testimony from when we interviewed him in February, and we will be presenting that testimony today. I'll now swear in our witness. The witness will please stand and raise his right hand.
This is just another
You
good
swear
reminder that
or
what
affirm
happens
on
at
the
these
penalty of
hearings
perjury
here, this
that
isn't
the
just a press
testimony you're about
conference.
to
This is
give
a
is the truth,
formal
the whole
hearing
truth, and nothing but the truth.
of the United
Help you
States
God.
Congress, which means there's
Thank you.
certain legal
You may be
obligations
seated.
and record that's being created, and that's
Let the record
every time
reflect
someone's
the
sworn
witness
in, that's
answered
an
in the
important thing
affirmative.
to
I now
recognize.
recognize myself for questions. I want to start by showing a video that tells the story of what was going on in the Trump White House on election night in November of 2020.
Do you remember where you were on the night of the election, November the 3rd?
I was at the White House.
Do you know where specifically over the course of that night you spent your time within the White House?
There was an event that was organized in the residence, so I moved between the residence, a room sort of off the residence where some family members were.
I take it the president was upstairs in the residence.
He was upstairs. We were kind of on the first floor, so not upstairs. We were with, mostly with Ivanka and her brothers and a couple other people who'd be coming in and out.
Can you just describe the atmosphere? What were people expecting that night when you got to the White House?
I think that there was, typically for people who show up there on election night, it's going to be a self-select, more positive environment. I think people were a little bit nervous, not knowing what was going to
Why is Jason Miller
happen
wearing a
with
mask?
the red wave or the red mirage
COVID
as the
conscience.
debate was being carried out.
Is
The Fox
anybody
News
within
Decision
6 feet of
Desk
him?
is calling Arizona for Joe Biden. That is a big get for the Biden campaign.
Arizona
Yeah,
was
because
called.
it was
Do you remember
53 to 45%.
What do you remember happening where you were when Arizona was called?
There was surprise at the call.
Who was surprised?
Who is that?
Most everyone in the room.
Were you being one of them?
Yes.
Did that shift the atmosphere or the attitude in the White House?
Completely.
How so? Can you describe that?
Because Fox News was the first one to go out and say that.
So was it anger kind of directed towards Fox News for making a call more so than like disappointment that maybe the campaign lost Arizona?
This guy
All
asking
the above.
questions looks like the former
So
Treasury
both
Secretary.
anger and disappointment.
Yeah.
Both disappointed with Fox and concerned that maybe our data or our numbers weren't accurate.
Were you in the White House residence during the
Rudy
sort of
drinking.
past midnight into the early morning hours of November 4th?
Yes, oh sure. It went over beyond midnight, yes.
Do you remember Rudy Giuliani being at the White House on election night and into the early hours the next morning?
I do.
What do you remember about when he came?
He was I had heard that he was upstairs, in that aforementioned reception area, and
He doesn't want to say it.
he was looking to talk to the president, and it was suggested instead that he come talk to several of us down off the map room.
Wow.
You said that you had heard that Mr. Giuliani wanted to talk to the president and then he was directed your way. Did you end up talking to Mr. Giuliani when he was directed your way?
I did.
What was that conversation?
A lot of conversations were directed my way. A few of us, myself, Jason
God, I
Miller,
wish he had been there today.
Justin Clark, and Mark Meadows, gathered in a room off the map room to listen to whatever Rudy presumably wanted to say to the president.
Was there anyone in that conversation who, in your observation, had too much to drink?
It's a leading question.
Like Mayor Giuliani.
Tell me more about that. What was your observation about his potential intoxication during that discussion about
Here we go.
what the president should say when he's addressed the nation on election night?
And the mayor was definitely intoxicated, but I do not know his level of intoxication when he spoke with the president, for example.
Were you part of any discussions with the people I mentioned, Mr. Steffi and Mr. Meadows, or anyone else, about whether the president should make any sort of speech on election night?
I spoke to the president. They may have been president, but President spoke to the president several times that night.
There were suggestions by, I believe it was Mayor Giuliani, to go and declare victory and say that we'd won it outright.
It was far too early to be making any calls like that. We're still being counted. Ballots were still going to be counted for days. And it was far too early to be making any proclamation like that.
Notice that Rudy has his own book behind him on his bookshelf.
To the best of my memory, I was saying that we should not go and declare victory until we had a better sense of the numbers.
Okay, can you be more specific about that conversation, in particular what Mayor Giuliani said, your response, and then anybody else in the room's response?
I think effectively Mayor Giuliani was saying, we won it. They're stealing it from us. Where'd all the votes come from? We need to go say that we won.
Voters.
And
ballot boxes.
Essentially, that anyone who didn't agree with that position was being weak.
What was your view at the time as to what he should or shouldn't say?
I don't know that I had a firm view as to what he should say in that circumstance. The results were still being counted. It was becoming clear that the race would not be called on election night.
My belief, my recommendation was to say that votes were still being counted. It's too early to tell, too early to call the race, but we proud of the race we ran, and we think we're in good position, and we'll have more to say about this the next day.
So basically, tell the truth. Basically, tell the truth.
And did anybody who was a part of that conversation disagree with your message?
Yes.
Who was that?
The president disagreed with that. I don't recall the particular words. He thought I was wrong. He told me so, and that they were gonna go he was gonna go in a different direction.
This is a fraud on the American public. This is an embarrassment to our country. We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election.
He's just out of his mind.
Mr.
I'm not sure what
Stywall,
Rudy Giuliani
did
being
President
drunk has
Trump
to do with it, though, really.
have any basis to declare victory
true
on
and
November
scandalous,
4th,
but-
2020? Thank you.
You're muted, sir.
Mr. Stepien also
Your mute is on.
testified that President Trump had no basis for declaring victory at that point in time.
My belief, my recommendation was to say that votes were still being counted. It's too early to tell, too early to call the race, but we proud of the race we ran, and we think we're in good position, and we'll have more to say about this the next day or the next day whenever we had something to say.
Thank you. Mr. Stilwell, after the votes were counted, who won the presidential election of 2020?
Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. of the great state of Delaware.
Thank you. That's the bottom line. We've had an election. Mr. Trump lost, but he refused to accept the results of the democratic process.
Great middle names.
Pursuant to Section 5C8 of House Resolution
Giuliani is still
503.
trending #1 on Twitter.
I now recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lofgren, for questions.
That's a little sad.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Schauwald, I'd like you to explain a term that was thrown around a lot during the election, and that's the so-called red mirage. What does that mean?
So in the 40 or 50 years, let's say, that Americans have increasingly chosen to vote by mail or early or absentee, Democrats prefer that method of voting more than Republicans do. So basically, in every election, Republicans win Election Day and Democrats win the early vote. And then you wait and start counting, and it depends on which ones you count first, but usually it's Election Day votes that get counted first. And you see the Republicans shoot ahead, and then the process of bailing and binding and unbinding all those mail-in votes. And some states like Pennsylvania refuse to count the votes first, so you have to wait for all of that to come in. So in every election, and certainly a national election, you expect to see the Republican with a lead, but it's not really a lead. When you put together a jigsaw puzzle, it doesn't matter which piece you put in first. It ends up with the same image. So for us, who cares? But that's because no candidate had ever tried to avail themselves of this quirk in the election counting system. We had gone to pains, and I'm proud of the pains we went to make sure that we were informing viewers that this was going to happen, because the Trump campaign and the president had made it clear that they were going to try to exploit this anomaly. And we knew it was going to be bigger because the percentage of early votes was higher, right? We went from about 45% of the votes being early and absentee to, because of the pandemic, that increased by about 50%. So we knew it would be longer, we knew it would be more. So we wanted to keep telling viewers, hey, look, the number that you see here is sort of irrelevant because it's only a small percentage of these votes.
So this red mirage, that's really what you expected to happen on election
You're such a
night.
Republican.
Happens every time.
Thank you, Mr. Stilwell.
So
Now,
do
I'd like
status
to
of
play
being a
a
Republican.
clip of Attorney General Bill Barr,
I vote early,
who also
in
explains
person.
what was expected to happen on election night.
I'm deep blue.
Right out of the box on election night, the president claimed that there was major fraud underway. I mean, this happened, as far as I could tell, before there was actually any potential of looking at evidence. And it seemed to be based on the dynamic that at the end of the evening, a lot of Democratic votes came in, which changed the vote counts in certain states. And that seemed to be the basis for this
Every
broad
vote that
claim
comes
there was
in
major
changes
fraud. And I didn't think much of that because people had been talking for weeks, and everyone understood for weeks that that was going to be what happened on election night.
Mr. Stepien obviously could not be with us today, and it's proper for him to be with his wife as they welcome their child. But he also had discussions with the president about the red mirage, that is, that it would be a long night and that early votes would favor him, but that lots more votes would be counted over the course of the night and the days after. So let's play clip 1 from our interview with Mr. Stepien.
I recounted back to that conversation with him, in which I said, just like I said in 2016 was going to be a long night. I told him in 2020 that it was going to be a process again, as the early returns are going to be positive, and we're going to be watching the returns of ballots as, they rolled in thereafter.
So is it fair to say you're trying to present what you thought would be a realistic picture of what might happen over the course of that night, being election night?
That night and the days that followed. Yeah, I always told the president the truth, and I think he expected that from me, and I told him it was going to be a process. It was going to be, we're going to have to wait and see how this turned out. So I just
well,
like
why you would have to explain this over and over to the man? It's not complicated.
It's not.
You shouldn't have to
let's
keep
watch
telling
a
him
short
and
clip
convincing
of
him
President
this is how it
Trump
works.
speaking after he received that information from his campaign
Remember when he said,
advisors.
"Stop counting the votes because we won"?
We want all voting to stop. We don't want them to find any ballots at 4 o'clock in the morning and add them to the list.
So when former President Trump said that, it contradicted what his advisors had warned would happen. We all know that mail-in ballots played an important role in the 2020 election. However, President Trump continuously discouraged mail-in voting. Mr. Stepien was so concerned about the president's position on mail-in voting that in the summer of 2020, he met with President Trump along with House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy. Let's play clip 4.
Meeting that was had, in particular, I invited Kevin McCarthy to join the meeting, he being of like mind on the issue with me, in which we made our case for why we believed mail-in voting, not to be a bad thing for his campaign. The president's mind was made up, and
Because he wanted to make this argument,
understand,
I believe. That's why he was saying it.
How many times to, go to the well on a particular topic.
Yeah, I understand. Tell me a little bit more about the argument that you and Mr. McCarthy made to the president in that meeting as to why it wasn't a bad thing that mail-in voting was available.
Largely two pillars to that argument, both of which I've previously mentioned. One, leaving a good deal to chance, pushing or urging your voters to vote only on election day leaves a lot to chance. That's A. And B, also previously mentioned, the fact that the Trump campaign, Republican National Committee, the Republican Party had an advantage of grassroots workers and volunteers on the ground that would allow, an advantage to enhance return rates.
Which is really a problem, Democrats.
Those were the two pillars of the argument.
I see. And what, if anything, do you recall Representative McCarthy saying during that meeting?
We were echoing the same argument. I mean, his words echoed mine, and vice versa on those two topics.
Mr. Stirewalt, you were at the decision desk at Fox News on election night, and you called Arizona early for President Biden, which was controversial. How did you make that call, and where did you think the race stood in the early
He's going to be like, I didn't think it was controversial at all.
Well, it was really controversial to our competitors who we beat so badly by making the correct call first. Our decision desk was the best in the business, and I was very proud to be a part of it. Because we had partnered with the Associated Press and the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago, thanks to my colleague and friend Arnon Mishkin, had built a wonderful device for forecasting the outcomes of elections. So we had a different set of data than our competitors did. We had more research, and we had a better system, and we had a great team. So what you're waiting to see is, do the actual votes match up with the expectations in the poll? The real votes are testing the quality of your poll in targeted precincts and in targeted places. And let me tell you, our poll in Arizona was beautiful. And it was doing just what we wanted it to do, and it was cooking up just right.
Look at him.
And at some point, and I forget
So excited.
exactly who, but at some point it became clear that Arizona was getting ready to make a call. So we my boss, Bill Salmon, said we're not making any call until
fishy to me.
everybody says yes, because that was always our policy, unanimity. And you have to understand, in this room, you have the best people from academia, Democrats, Republicans, a broad cross-section of people who had worked together for a decade, who are really serious about this stuff. So we knew it would be a consequential call because it was one of 5 states that really mattered, right?
Yep.
Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona were the ones that we were watching. We knew it would be significant to call any one of those 5, but we already knew Trump's chances were very small and getting smaller based on what we had seen. So we were able to make the call early. We were able to beat the competition. We looked around the room, everybody says yay, and on we go. And by the time we found out how much everybody was freaking out and losing their minds over this call, we were already trying to call the next state. We had already moved on. We were to Georgia, we were to North Carolina, we were looking at these other states.
Wow.
So we thought we were pleased, but not surprised.
I see. After the election, as of November 7th, in your judgment, what were the chances of President Trump winning the election?
After that point?
Yes.
None. I mean, I guess it's always possible that you could have, a truckload of ballots be found somewhere, I suppose. But once you get into this space, ahead of today, I thought about what are the largest margins that could ever be overturned by a recount, and the kind of stuff that we heard Mike Pence talking about, sounding like a normal Republican that night when he said, we'll keep every challenge. Nothing like that. In a recount, you're talking about hundreds of votes. When we think about calling a race, one of the things that we would think about is it outside the margin of a recount? And when we think about that margin, we think about, in modern history, you're talking about 1,000 votes, 1,500 votes at the way, way outside. Normally, you're talking about hundreds of votes, maybe 300 votes that are going to change. So the idea that through any normal process in any of these states, remember, he had to do it thrice, right? He needed 3 of these states to change.
They did see that amount of change in
order
Arizona.
To do that,
More people voted for Biden than they originally counted.
You're better off to play the Powerball than to have that come in.
On November 7th, the other major news outlets called the race for President Biden. Now, Mr. Stepien told the committee that he thought the odds were, and this is a quote, very, very, very bleak, and held a meeting with the president that same day. Let's show video clip 8.
I mean, with each day that wore on, I mean, the trajectory
what's he
of the
doing
race, on election night, Trump
Looking
ahead,
forlorn.
In many states. And as that week wore on, as the 3rd became the 4th, became the 5th, and so on and so forth, and the vote by mail ballots were tabulated, Trump's lead, grew more narrow, and in some places, Biden surpassed, Trump in the vote totals. So as the week wore on, as we paid attention to those numbers multiple times a day, internally, I was feeling less confident for sure.
What was your view on the state of the election at that point?
Very, very, very bleak. We told him, the group that went over there outlined, my belief in chances for success at this point, and then we pegged it at 5, maybe 10% based on recounts that either were automatically initiated or could be initiated based on realistic legal challenges, not all the legal challenges that eventually were pursued, but it was my belief is that it was a very, very 5 to 10%. It's not a very good optimistic outlook.
So like in Dumb and Dumber. So you're saying
now,
I've got a
President
chance.
Trump and others continued to claim that the election was stolen.
Movie I've never seen.
There were lawyers who were a part of the campaign lawyers who were responsible for investigating the fraud claims. That includes Alex Cannon, who could not validate the claims that were being made, including those being made by the president. Let's roll video 15. 13.
Wow, look at her.
This is an email. It's two emails, actually. The first is from Alex Cannon to you and Faith
Where's the
McPherson.
video?
And then you forward that email on to Mark Meadows, Justin Clark, and Jason Miller, the subject being AZ Federal ID voters. If you look at the original email there, it says, Bill, we completed the AZ analysis you requested. I assume that's about Arizona. And because of the substantial uncertainty surrounding the databases, this is a highly unreliable way to identify ineligible voters. Can you explain the task that you gave to Ms. Cannon for this Arizona analysis?
Sure. Previously, I described some of my frustration with some of the claims that people would throw at President Trump regarding, you need to look at this, this happened in this state or that happened in that state. And it would be, those would flow to us to look into. I talked about that before, I think.
Yep.
This is an example of that. I recall in Arizona, someone had thrown out, I believe this to be the claim, that there were thousands of illegal citizens, people not eligible to vote, having cast their ballots in Arizona. Yeah. Someone had thrown out that claim to President Trump. And with, the margins being as close as they were, as I previously described, that could potentially matter. So this wild claim is thrown out, which, on its face didn't seem, realistic or possible to me. I asked Alex to look at the claim, and I haven't read this full email, but I recall the response
Who made the claim?
to that. The reality of that was not illegal citizens voting in the election. I think it was like overseas voters voting in the election. So obviously, people who were eligible to vote.
When these findings were passed up the chain to President Trump, he became frustrated and he replaced the campaign's legal team. Let's play clip 14.
Wow.
I think the president, it was during the second week where things like you displayed were occurring, where he was growing increasingly unhappy with his team, me less so because I was less involved at this point, but still me growing increasingly unhappy with Justin Clark, and that kind of paved the way for Justin to be moved out.
I love the forlorn picture that shows of him.
The legal side of the campaign, and for all intents and purposes, the campaign at that point.
Oh, and that's Trump in that picture. I didn't notice that before.
Now, when Mr. Stepien became campaign manager, he was the second Trump campaign manager for the 2020 race, and there were only about 115 days until Election Day. So let's play the video.
I inherited a campaign that was, the day I was hired was, I believe, President Trump's low point in the 2020 daily average polling against President Biden. It was a campaign at a low point in the polls. It was structurally and fiscally deficient. There was a great deal wrong with the campaign in both of those those areas. So most of my day spent fixing and I think I took over with 115 days left in the campaign. Most of my time was spent fixing the things that could be fixed with 115 days left in the campaign.
Just what's so scary
now,
that had
Mr.
they run a decent campaign,
has been
still could have
in
won this
the
thing.
campaign field
Shocking.
for a long time, and he worked for lots of different candidates and campaigns. He testified to this committee about his concerns given the claims that Mr. Giuliani and Ms. Powell and their team were making publicly. Let's play clip 15.
Okay, and was it important for you, Mr. Stepien, to sort of pull back just for your own professional
Change
reputation?
the
You didn't want to be associated
lighting in the
with
room.
some of
Yeah, the
what
white
you were
balance
hearing
changed.
from the Giuliani team and others that sort of stepped in the wake of your departure?
I didn't mind being categorized. There were two groups of them. We called them kind of my team and Rudy's team. I didn't mind being characterized as being part of Team Normal, as reporters, kind of started to do around that point in time. I said, hours ago, early on that, I've been doing this for a long time, 25 years, and I've spanned, political ideologies
How
from
old is
Trump
he?
to McCain
He's
to
like a
Bush
young fella.
to Christie, and I can work under a lot of circumstances for a lot of varied, candidates and politicians, but a situation where, and I think along the way I've built up a pretty good, I hope, a good reputation for being honest and professional, and I didn't think what was happening was necessarily honest or professional at that point in time. So that led to me stepping away.
So the president did get rid of Team Normal, and I'd like to play a clip showing that the president found the people he needed to perpetuate.
How long before
his
Team
claims
Normal
of
is
fraud.
trending on Twitter?
They saw a big truck bringing in 100,000 ballots in garbage cans, in waste paper baskets, in cardboard boxes, and in shopping baskets. And every single one of them was for Biden because they were being notified by Smartmatic in Frankfurt
Smartmatic.
that Biden was way behind and they better come up with a lot more ballots. And we can prove every single thing I just said. If you gave me the paper ballots, I could probably turn around each one of these states. I'm absolutely convinced if you let me examine each one of those ballots, I'd pull out enough that were fraudulent that it would shake the hell out of the country.
It can set and run an algorithm that probably ran all over the country to take a certain percentage of votes from President Trump and flip them to President Biden, which we might never have uncovered
on Twitter,
had the votes for President Trump not been so overwhelming in so many of these states that it broke the algorithm.
I remember that one of the things Mark said at some point was, you can't show an actual vote was flipped, which I found at the time to be a remarkable assertion because you don't have to have the gun to see the body lying on the floor bleeding out with 5 bullet holes in it was killed by a gun.
What they were proposing, I thought was nuts. And the theory was also completely nuts, right? I mean, it was a combination of Italians, Germans. I mean, different things have been floating around as to who was involved. Remember Hugo Chavez and the Venezuelan. She has an affidavit from somebody who says they wrote a software in, it's something with the Philippines, and just all over the radar.
Did you ever share, Mr. Kushner, your view of Mr. Giuliani? Did you ever share your perspective about him with the president?
I guess
Team Normal's number 5 on Twitter.
yes.
Tell me what you said.
Basically, not the approach I would take if I was you.
Okay, and how did he react? How did President Trump react when you shared that view with him?
We said, I have confidence in Rudy.
I think I had conversations with probably all of our council who are signed up to assist on election day as they disengaged with the campaign. The general consensus was that the law firms were not comfortable making the arguments that Rudy Giuliani was making publicly. I seem to recall that I had a similar conversation with most all of them.
I made it clear I did not agree with the idea of saying the election was stolen and putting out this stuff, which I told the president was bullshit. And, I didn't want to be a part of it, and that's one of the reasons that went into me deciding to leave when I did.
Even Sidney Powell,
If anybody knows bullshit, it's
defending
that guy.
herself in a defamation lawsuit brought by Dominion Voting Systems, argued that, quote, no reasonable person would conclude that her statements were truly statements of fact. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
No reasonable person would conclude they were.
I thank the witness for joining us
She's saying
today.
Team Normal wouldn't believe
First
it.
panel is now dismissed.
Oh, did you see that wink? Did you
Yeah.
see that wink? Who
Oh,
was he winking
QAnon's
at?
gonna blow
Little
up.
Tug
But
his
look,
ear.
They could have done more with him. I
He
feel
was
like.
fantastic.
Yeah,
I
but
loved him.
I agree. He was fantastic.
Without
and he
objection,
should
the
have
chair
said more.
recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms.
Hey,
Lawson.
by the way, the host recognizes himself for a
Thank you,
moment
Mr.
here.
Chairman.
We could use that phrase.
Last week, we presented the testimony of former Attorney General Bill Barr, who testified before this committee. Today, we present additional evidence, including his testimony that former President Trump started making claims of election fraud immediately after the election, and that Barr concluded the claims were untrue. Now, due to the length of Attorney General Barr's testimony, we're only going to include relevant portions at the hearing today. So let's play the video.
I hope they make
The
a
department,
playlist
in
of all
fact, when we received specific and credible allegations of fraud, made an effort to look into these to satisfy ourselves that they were without merit. And I was in the posture of trying to figure out, there was an avalanche of all these allegations of fraud that built up over a number of days, and it was like playing whack-a-mole because something would come out one day and then the next day it would be another issue. Also, I was influenced by the fact that all the early claims that I understood were completely bogus and silly and usually based on complete misinformation. And so I didn't consider the quality of claims right out of the box to give me any feeling that there was really substance here.
For the first time since the election, the Attorney General spoke personally with the President on November 23rd, and this was at the White House. Let's play the video, please.
So on November 23rd, I hadn't spoken to the President since the election, and in fact, as I said, since the middle of October, roughly. And it was a little getting awkward because obviously he had lost the election and I hadn't said anything to him. And so Cipollone said, I think it's time you come over here. And so I came over to meet with the president in the Oval Office, and Meadows and Cipollone were there. And the president, and this is leading up to this conversation with Kushner, the president said there had been major fraud and that as soon as the facts were out, the results of the election would be reversed. And he went on this for quite a while, as he's prone to do. And then he got to something that I was expecting, which is to say that apparently the Department of Justice doesn't think that it has a role of looking into these fraud claims. And I said, that has to be the campaign that raises that with the state. The department doesn't take side in elections, and the department is not an extension of your legal team. And our role is to investigate fraud, and we'll look at something if it's specific, credible, and could have affected the outcome of the election. And we're doing that, and it's just not. They're just not meritorious. They're not panning out. And as I walked out of the Oval Office, Jared was there with Dan Scavino, who ran the president's social media, and who I thought was a reasonable guy and believe is a reasonable guy. And I said, how long is he going to carry on with this stolen election stuff? Where's this going to go? And by that time, Meadows had caught up with me, and leaving the office, and caught up to me and said that he said, look, I think that he's becoming more realistic and knows that there's a limit to how far he can take this. And then Jared said, yeah, we're working on this. We're working on it.
Wow.
Even
It's
after his
so
attorney general
petulant.
told him his claims of election fraud were false, President Trump continued to promote these claims.
I felt that things continued to deteriorate between the 23rd and the weekend of the 29th. And then on November 29th, he appeared on Maria Bartiromo's show, Sunday Futures, I believe it was, and he said that the department was missing in action.
Well, no, we had glitches where they moved thousands of votes from my account to Biden's account, and these are glitches. So they're not glitches, they're theft, they're fraud, absolute fraud. This election was over, and then they did dumps. They call them dumps, big, massive dumps in Michigan and Pennsylvania and all over. How the FBI and Department of Justice, I don't know, maybe they're involved, but how people are allowed to get away from this stuff
Maybe they're
this stuff
involved.
is unbelievable.
The look on her face.
Now, spurred by
Maybe
what
the
he
Justice
saw,
Department and the FBI
Barr
are involved
told
too.
the Associated Press on December
Paranoia.
1st that there was no evidence of election fraud. And immediately after Attorney General Barr's statement went public, Mr. Trump berated and he nearly fired Barr. But Barr persisted in telling the president that there was no evidence to support the fraud claims.
Incredible.
This got under my skin, but I also felt it was time for me to say something. So I set up a lunch with the AP reporter, Mike Balsamo, and I told him at lunch, I made this statement.
Why'd you have to do it over lunch?
That to date we have not seen fraud on a scale that could have affected a different outcome in the election. I had a later meeting scheduled at the White House at 3 o'clock with Meadows.
For some snacks.
This was previously scheduled, so I knew this was going to come up, and I went over there, and I told my secretary that I thought I would probably be fired and told not to go home. I mean, not to go back to my office, so I said, you might have to pack up for me. And so when I got over there, I met with the chief of staff. He said the president was angry. He didn't really get into the issue of the fraud. And then I went up to Pat Cipollone's office, and we were talking with each other. And word came down that he wanted us both to go to the Oval. And the president was as mad as I've ever seen him, and he was trying to control himself. And the president said, well, this is killing me. You didn't have to say this. You must have said this because you hate Trump. You hate Trump. And then he raised the big vote dump, as he called it, in Detroit. And that, he said people saw boxes coming into the counting station at all hours of the morning and so forth. And I explained to him that at that point I knew the exact number of precincts in Detroit. I think it was 630 something. I said, Mr. President, there are 630 precincts in Detroit, and unlike elsewhere in the state, they centralized the counting process, so they're not counted in each precinct. They're moved to counting stations, and so the normal process would involve boxes coming in at all different hours. So there's nothing. And I said, did anyone point out to you, did all the people complaining about it point out to you, you actually did better in Detroit than you did last time? I mean, there's no indication of fraud in Detroit. Yes. And I told him that the stuff that his people were shoveling out to the public was bullshit. I mean, that the claims of fraud were bullshit. And he was indignant about that. And I reiterated that they'd wasted a whole month on these claims on the Dominion voting machines, and they were idiotic claims. And
such a piece.
I specifically raised the Dominion voting machines, which I found to be among the most disturbing allegations, disturbing in the sense that I saw absolutely zero basis for the allegations, but they were made in such a sensational way that they obviously were influencing a lot of people, members of the public. that there was this systemic corruption in the system and that their votes didn't count and that these machines controlled by somebody else were actually determining it, which was complete nonsense. And it was being laid out there. And I told them that it was crazy stuff and they were wasting their time on that. And it was doing great disservice to the country.
Okay, so the very next day, the president released a video rehashing some of the very same claims that his chief law enforcement officer had told him were, quote, nonsense.
Here's an example. This is Michigan. At 6:31 in the morning, a vote dump of 149,772 votes came in unexpectedly. We were winning by a lot. That batch was received in horror. We have a company that's very suspect. Its name is Dominion. With the turn of a dial or the change of a chip, you can press a button for Trump and the vote goes to Biden. What kind of a system is this?
One that doesn't exist. That's what kind of a system this
Barr
is.
again told the president
That's
there
not
was
true.
nothing to these claims on December 14th.
When I walked in, sat down, he went off on a monologue saying that there was now definitive evidence involving fraud through the Dominion machines. And a report had been prepared by a very reputable cybersecurity firm, which he identified as Allied Security Operations Group, and he held up the report, and then he asked that a copy of it be made for me. And while a copy was being made, he said, you know, this is absolute proof that the Dominion machines were rigged. The report means that I'm going to have a second term. And then he gave me a copy of the report. And as he talked more and more about it, I sat there flipping through the report and looking through it. And to be frank, it looked very amateurish to me. Didn't have the credentials of the people involved, but I didn't see any real qualifications. And the statements were made very conclusory, like, you know, these machines were designed to, you know, engage in fraud or something to that effect, but I didn't see any supporting information for it. And I was somewhat demoralized because I thought, boy, if he really believes this stuff, he has, you know, lost contact with he's become detached from reality if he really believes this stuff. On the other hand, you know, when I went into this and would, you know, tell him how crazy some of these allegations were, there was never an indication of interest in what the actual facts were. In my opinion then, and my opinion now, is that the election was not stolen by fraud. And I haven't seen anything since the election that changes my mind on that, including the 2000 Mules movie.
Well, maybe you can assess that 2,000 mules, and people are talking about
He's such a troll.
Well, I mean, just in a nutshell, you know, I just think the GBI was unimpressed with it, and I was similarly unimpressed with it because I think I was holding my fire on that to see what the photographic evidence was, because I thought, well, hell, if they have a lot of photographs of the same person dumping a lot of ballots in different boxes, you know, that's hard to explain. So I wanted to see what the photographic evidence was, but
I have never heard of the 2000
cell phone
Mules
data
movie.
is singularly unimpressive. I mean, it basically, if you take 2 million cell phones and figure out where they are physically in a big city like Atlanta or wherever, just by definition, you're going to find many hundreds of them have passed by and spent time in the vicinity of these boxes. And the premise that, you know, if you go by a box, 5 boxes or whatever it was, that's a mule is just indefensible. It by definition, you're going to have hundreds of this. I mean, I saw one contractor said, we figured out that our truck alone would account for 6 cell phone signals.
I'm glad the Attorney General of the United States is watching trash like 2,000
Our route would
mules.
take us by these things on a regular basis. So but then when the movie came out, I think the photographic evidence in it was completely I mean, there was a little bit of it, but it was lacking. It didn't establish widespread illegal harvesting. The other thing is people don't understand is that it's not clear that even if you can show harvesting, that changes the results of the election. The courts are not going to throw out votes and then figure out what votes were harvested and throw them out. It's still the burden on the challenging party to show that illegal votes were cast. Votes were the result of undue influence or bribes, or there was really, the person was non compos mentis. But absent that evidence, I just didn't see courts throwing out votes anyway. I felt that before the election, it was possible to talk sense to the president. And while you sometimes had to engage in, a big wrestling match with him, that it was possible to keep things on track, but I felt that after the election, he didn't seem to be listening, and I didn't think it was, that I was inclined not to stay around if he wasn't listening to advice from me or his other cabinet secretaries.
And again, the Attorney General is
December
not
14th,
supposed to be in those conversations with the president. It's not his job.
Now, the Attorney General wasn't the only person who told the president that his claims were false. Other officials and close advisors told him the same thing.
Rather than try to address a counterfactual or a hypothetical, let me just say there were instances where the president would say, people are telling me this, or I've heard this, or I saw on television, this impropriety in Atlanta or Pennsylvania or something. And we were in a position to say, our people have already looked at that, and we know that you're getting bad information, that's not correct. It's been demonstrated to be incorrect from our point of view, and been debunked.
A month and a half or so after the election day, and at that meeting, various allegations of fraud were discussed, and Eric and Pat didn't, told the group, the president included, that none of those allegations had been substantiated to the point where they could be the basis for any litigation challenge to the election.
President Trump's own vice president and his top advisors also knew that there wasn't evidence to support the claims that the president was making.
Anyone else other than Mr. Meadows who asked you about the status outside of your legal group, Mr. Morgan and the others you mentioned, anyone else who asked you the status of what you were finding in your assessment of it?
Yes, sir.
Who's that?
Peter Navarro.
When did you talk to Mr. Navarro?
Mid-November.
Around the same time as Mr. Meadows?
Yes, sir.
And tell me about that conversation.
I recall him asking me questions about Dominion and maybe some other categories of allegations of voter fraud. And I remember telling him that I didn't believe the Dominion allegations because I thought the hand recount in Georgia would resolve any issues with the technology problem and with Dominion or Dominion flipping votes. And I mentioned at that time that the CISA, Chris Krebs, had recently released a report saying that the election was secure. And I believe Mr. Navarro accused me of being an agent of the deep state working with Chris Krebs against the president.
Wow.
And I never took another phone call from Mr. Navarro.
Anyone else besides Mr. Meadows, Mr. Navarro, Mr. Hirschman that you had discussions with inquiring about what you were finding in your review of the allegations that were pouring in?
I believe I had about a 15-second conversation with the vice president about it as well.
When was that?
Wow.
During one of the visits to the White House, I don't know which one. I think it was the first one in November. I had met him briefly at the campaign, and he remembered me and saw me. And he asked what I was doing on the campaign, and I told him that, we were looking into some of the issues related to voter fraud. And he asked me, I don't remember his exact words, but he asked me if we were finding anything. And I said that I didn't believe we were finding it, or I was not personally finding anything sufficient to alter the results of the election. And he thanked me. That was our interaction.
At a later hearing, you'll hear live testimony from the former acting Deputy Attorney General of the Department of Justice, Rich Donahue. But now I'd like to play a portion of his testimony.
I tried to, again, put this in perspective and to try to put it in very clear terms to the president. And I said something to the effect of, sir, we've done dozens of investigations, hundreds of interviews. The major allegations are not supported by the evidence developed. We've looked at Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Nevada. We're doing our job. Much of the info you're getting is false. And then I went into, for instance, this thing from Michigan, this report about 68% error rate. Reality is it was only 0.0063% error rate, less than 1 in 15,000. So the president accepted that. He said, okay, fine, but what about the others? And again, this gets back to the point that there were so many of these allegations that when you gave him a very direct answer on one of them, he wouldn't fight us on it, but he would move to another allegation.
Totally.
So then I talked about a little bit about the Pennsylvania truck driver. This is another allegation that had come up. And
this all describes what delusional people do with facts.
Believed, perhaps honestly, that he had transported an entire tractor-trailer truck full of ballots from New York to Pennsylvania. And this was, again, out there.
I mean, these are all allegations I haven't even heard. Have you heard a lot of these?
And I essentially said, look, we looked at that allegation. We looked at both ends, both the people who load the truck and the people who unload the truck. And that allegation was not supported by the evidence. Again, he said, okay. And then he said, no, I didn't mention that one. What about the others? And I said, okay, well, with regard to Georgia, we looked at the tape, we interviewed the witnesses. There is no suitcase. The president kept fixating on this suitcase that supposedly had fraudulent ballots and that the suitcase was rolled out from under the table. And I said, no, sir, there is no suitcase. You can watch that video over and over. There is no suitcase. There is a wheeled bin where they carry the ballots, and that's just how they move ballots around that facility. There's nothing suspicious about that at all. I told them that there was no multiple scanning of the ballots. One part of that allegation was that they were taking one ballot and scanning it through 3 or 4 or 5 times to rack up votes, presumably for Vice President Biden. I told them that the video did not support that. Then he went off on double voting at the top of the next page. He said, dead people are voting. Indians are getting paid to vote. He meant people on Native American reservations. He said there's lots of fraud going on here. Told him flat out that much of the information he's getting is false and or just not supported by the evidence. We look at the
From
allegations,
QAnon.
but they don't pan out.
Yep.
Mr. Barr and his advisors were not the only ones who determined that the president's allegations regarding Dominion voting machines were false. So, Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to include in the record of this hearing reports issued by the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, otherwise known as CISA, that addressed and rejected the claims of manipulation of voting machines in the 2020 election.
So great.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you,
ordered. I
Mr.
was
Chairman.
saying,
I also
that's
ask
close.
unanimous consent to include in the record a report prepared by the Michigan Senate Oversight Committee that disproved claims of election fraud in Michigan, as well as a statement by 59 of the country's leading election security scientists, noting the absence of any credible evidence that the 2020 election had been altered through technical compromise, and 5 other reports from organizations and individuals confirming there was no widespread fraud in the 2020 election or describing the spread of the former president's lies.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman,
I mean,
and
just
I yield
all
back.
of this evidence that he was told and
Pursuant
continued
to
on,
the order
and yet he
of the
persisted,
committee
right?
for today, the chair declares the committee in recess for a period of approximately 10 minutes.
All right, so they're going to take a 10-minute break here. Wow. Okay. There's a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, they took painstaking attempt to lay out all of that evidence and these just all the people that over and over and over for months. And the fact that Justice Department officials were being told by the president what to investigate, and then they were investigating it, is, well, it's what's the phrase people always use in this? It's highly irregular. Like, that's not what the president should be doing with the Justice Department. There is a presumed independence of the Justice Department from either the Congress or the administration, the executive branch. And even though, and this is a funny thing in our system, even though the Attorney General is appointed by the president, there's supposed to be this distinction. Bill Barr blew through it, didn't care, was constantly in conversations with Trump. Like other attorneys generals have said, I would go months without ever talking to the president. I mean, Bill Barr is getting called over there by Bill Seppian and by, Cipollino and these guys.
the president
have no business being able to tell the Attorney General of the United States what to do.
Right, but Donald Trump
William
saw
Barr does
Donald Trump saw the Attorney General as his own legal team, but not just defensive, but offensive too, to do his bidding, to do his research, to go after the stuff that he wanted. And it's completely an inappropriate use of the Attorney General. But given everything else that we've seen, Donald Trump had just no understanding of how this stuff works. Comes as no surprise.
Well, that's right. Well, he did know how it works, I think. I mean, there may have been a point going into it that, look, there's not a lot of people who have a job that you're in for 4 years where you don't learn the job. And if you didn't learn the job, that shows you're completely incapable of performing the duties. Bill Barr knew the job. Bill Barr had been the Attorney General previously.
Yep.
He knew how to behave, and he didn't behave this way. And someone put up in the chat, I think it was Jim that said, it's shocking how many people had to go along with all this. Some statement to that effect. And I think he's absolutely right about this. It's really a shocking notion when you look at all the people that had to be involved in trying to correct the president, people coming in, the sort of Mad Hatter nature of Rudy Giuliani and Powell and these people, full access to the president of the United States when the president of the United States still has a job to do. I think you brought it up, Rob, when we went to Inauguration Day and watched the helicopter leave the White House and watch Donald Trump fly away, which was just such a great feeling.
Felt so good.
That the period between an election and an inauguration is entirely too long, right? That we need to figure out, because look, this is not going to be the last time that Republican voters are going to be comfortable electing someone with the sensibilities of Donald Trump.
Yeah.
I mean, until the insurrection, even Liz Cheney was comfortable re-electing Donald Trump. Yep. So people who, are reasonable when, certain things happen, were not. So they're going to continue to want to elect people like Donald Trump. And that's something we're going to have to figure out in the system here, because as you said earlier, it wasn't just January 6th where people got out of hand. Donald Trump was building this from, his inauguration day in 2017. He started saying, if we don't win re-election, it's a fraud, and said it all the way through until after the election, and continued to say it was a fraud. So his delusional narrative that there's no way that we won't win unless we're cheated was something he said before 2016, before 2020, after 2020, and he'll say it in the future. So we've got to figure something out.
What we've heard this morning so far is that his attorney general was telling him, you lost and there's nothing to these. His campaign manager was telling him, you lost and there's nothing to these allegations. Researchers on his campaign team were telling him, you lost and there's nothing to these allegations. And so they're making the case that the president was given this information repeatedly from multiple sources, credible sources, and yet chose to go with the story, the narrative that was being sown by Team Abnormal, which, by the way, Team Normal is just going to be the best from now on. Team Normal currently trending number 7 on Twitter.
But let's not overly.
Just one more thing,
Sure.
just to renew your faith in the American public. Big massive dumps trending number 13 on Twitter, which I mean,
Twitter just continues to really provide itself the support for its great quality. Look, before we get to why couldn't he listen to the normal people? These were people that worked incredibly hard to re-elect a man who went on to do this.
Yes.
That they couldn't see beforehand that this was the same guy. He behaved exactly the same way after the election as he did before the election. So this idea that somehow, we've now all woken up, great, glad to have you. A little sermon moment here on a Monday. There's a great parable of the workers who worked all day and the workers who worked for 5 hours and the workers who only worked for 1 hour. And in the kingdom of God, you're all welcome. The same reward. But if you're going to be the people who only came to the realization after an insurrection that the guy you had supported, who behaved utterly consistently all the way through, from threatening protesters with the use of the federal government resources, to clearing Lafayette Park, to saying to police officers, don't take it so easy when you put them in the car, then telling people to be violent. The guy was threatening violence galore, constant, like all the things that brought about January 6th insurrection action Donald Trump was doing previously, and Team Normal was working to make sure that he maintained the power of the presidency.
Yes. And Bill Sepien came on board with 115 days to go before the election. Do you think, did Donald Trump just start this abnormal behavior, at day 114? No, it had been going on for 4 years, and even before that.
Yeah, 4 years and before 4 years.
So Bill Sepien, for you to say your Team Normal, no, buddy, you signed on to work for what we all knew. Like, you don't get to be, and Bill Barr, same thing with Bill Barr. You don't get to take some kind of moral high ground here.
Right.
That Rudy Giuliani is the crazy one. Sidney Powell Lowell is the crazy one. I'm normal. No.
Right. Let's talk about the Mueller report. Yeah.
We knew this about this man, and so it's the people and it's the people who worked for him. Like, they all have, like, they are all culpable for this. You know, Kevin McCarthy said the other day that all Americans are responsible for the insurrection. No.
He did?
Yes, he did. You didn't see that?
No.
Yeah, that every American, all of us deserve blame for what
sure.
happened on
It's all of
January
us.
6th. Yeah, no, Kevin.
All lives are guilty to Kevin McCarthy.
Yeah. You are responsible. You and all of the people who knew what Donald Trump was and is and enabled him to
And you
get
didn't
away
need to
with
be.
all of this. You didn't need to be.
You didn't need to be. Because the guy told you when he was asked, will you support President Biden if you lose the election? And he said, we'll have to see. So, which is a Trumpism for no.
No.
Right. So the idea here, and I'm sure the committee is going to start to lay this out. Well, I don't know if they will, actually. Maybe they're going to just try to take it from, mostly from election day forward. But Trump had been setting up this game because this was his playbook. And I know we've said it here a bunch, and we're going to say it a bunch more times. He said the same thing about the Iowa caucus when he didn't win it in 2015, or maybe early 2016, January of 2016. Said it was a fraud. Said that all of the states that he didn't win in the primary was a fraud and people were cheating. He'd been saying this same stuff from before he ran for president, that these elections are fraudulent. He's somebody who voted in 2 different states by mail and was saying that mail voters are
Yeah, and
it's this idea that everything with him is projection or confession, and sometimes it's both.
Yes,
It's
and
amazing.
Mark Meadows, his chief of staff, like, voted fraudulently, and
as it turns out, that's right. Yeah. So okay, Donald Trump, maybe really turned the crank when he kind of lost, when he lost the election and realized what shame that is. And look, there's story after story of people who have been met with the reality of the world and have had some kind of a delusional detachment from reality to the point that they just can't see it and won't hear it and continue to go down a track of saying things that are provably untrue. That is common. And that is what we're seeing with the former president of the United States. He was so chosenly unwilling to accept the truth. And in my view, is such a habitual liar that he will simply say things that are not true. And I actually think it's part of a whole philosophy. And when you look at the philosophy of Donald Trump and what comes sort of out of the power of positive thinking world that he's from, which isn't all wacky. He's just wacky with it. He really does believe in this kind of name it and claim it narrative that you can say things and speak them into reality. And so he just wouldn't let people be around him who would say things that he didn't want to be true. He didn't care if they were true. He didn't want them to be true. So he wouldn't let those things take root. So he would, as we heard, in that last description, people coming to him with, we've answered this question, we've answered this claim, we've looked into this story you've heard. None of them are true. And he's just like, well, what about the next one? Well, what about the next one? Yeah. Any of us who've done people work with folks who have detached from reality recognize this. And I'm not a psychologist, and I know that psychologists are very careful not to do psychoanalysis on people. But it's obvious what's happening here. And some of us saw it sort of from afar by just the little things Trump was saying. And then you get into this testimony and you're like, well, this is what's going on. This man is so detached, and he hasn't gotten any better. He has continued to say even more bizarre things. Mm-hmm. So if anything, look, this is the start of the 2024 campaign in some ways, that if he's going to try to run, and I don't think that's why the committee's doing it. I just think this is what we all need to know and need to see, that if this man wants to offer himself again as the candidate, Republicans one more time are going to be given a chance to look this one square in the face and make a call. And the question is, will they be able to make that decision again? And it doesn't seem to me that there's hardly anything that tells you that these people are capable of making another choice, because it almost doesn't matter who the vehicle is. There's just a commitment to hating Democrats to such a degree that there's 50 million people who will just vote no matter who it is.
Yeah.
Sorry, let's get back. You got something to say before I get back to...
Nope.
State's Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia. Mr. Smith is a former city commissioner for the city of Philadelphia, where he served for more than 10 years. Mr. Ginsburg is one of the leading election law attorneys in the country and has represented Republican presidential candidates in election litigation dating back to 2000, where he represented George W. Bush in the Bush v. Gore litigation. I will now swear in our witnesses. Please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm on the penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God. Thank you. Please be seated. Let the record reflect the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Pursuant to Section 5C8 of House Resolution 503, I now recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lofgren, for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before the break, I think you all heard Mr. Barr and Mr. Donahue talk about the false claims that Mr. Trump and his supporters made about suitcases of fake ballots in Georgia. We have a witness here today who thoroughly investigated that. Issue. Mr. Pack, I want to thank you for appearing before us today. You were appointed by President Trump to serve as the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia, and you served from 2017 until January of 2021. You were the lead federal prosecutor there and worked for the Department of Justice under then Attorney General Bill Barr. Now, were you ever asked by Attorney General Barr to investigate claims of voter fraud in the 2020 election? And if so, what were those claims?
Thank you, Congressman Lofgren. Thank you for the question. Approximately December 4th, I believe, of 2020, Attorney General Barr and I had a conversation about an unrelated case to the case at issue. At the end of the conversation, Mr. Barr had asked me if I had seen a certain videotape that was being reported in the news where Mr. Giuliani, in a Senate subcommittee hearing that was held the day before, May 3rd, showed a videotape of a purportedly a security tape at the State Farm Arena in Atlanta, which is also in Fulton County in the city of Atlanta. Yes. At the time, Mr. Barr asked me that he had made a public statement that he had not seen any widespread election fraud that would question the outcome of the election. And because of the videotape and the serious allegation that Mr. Giuliani was making with respect to the suitcase full of ballots purported in the video, he asked me to find out what I could about it, because he had envisioned that in some days after our call that he was going to go to the White House for a meeting, and then that issue might come up. He asked me to make it a priority to get to the bottom of, to try to substantiate the allegation made by Mr. Giuliani.
Thank you. I understand the Georgia Secretary of State's office investigated those State Farm Arena allegations and didn't find any evidence of fraud. What did you find when your office conducted its own investigation?
We found that the suitcase full of ballots, the alleged black suitcase that was being seen pulled from under the table, was actually an official lockbox where ballots were kept safe. We found out that there was a mistake in terms of a misunderstanding that there were done counting ballots or tallying ballots for the night, and the partisan watchers that was assigned by each of the respective parties were announced to send home. But once they realized the mistake, someone from the Secretary of State's office had indicated that, no, we're not done for the night. You need to go ahead and continue counting. So once they packed up the lockbox full of ballots, they brought back the official ballot box again and continue to tally the ballots from the lockbox.
I love the word
Unfortunately,
lockbox is back in
during
our
the Senate
political,
hearing, Mr. Giuliani only played a clip that showed them pulling out the official ballot box from under the table and referring to that as a smoking gun of a fraud in Fulton County. But in actuality, in review of the entire video, it showed that that was actually an official ballot box that was kept underneath the tables. And then we saw them pack up because of the announcement that they thought they were done for the night. And then once the announcement was made that you should continue counting, they brought the ballot box out and they continued to count. The FBI interviewed the individuals that are depicted in the videos that purportedly were double, triple counting of the ballots, and determined that nothing irregular happened in the counting, and the allegations made by Mr. Giuliani were false.
Thank you very much. I'd like to play again a testimony from Mr. Donahue, who appeared before the committee before today.
Mr. Donahue, we talked at some length about whether or not the White House or the president was informed about the Antrim report. On the result of the investigations, the interviews that had gone on Fulton County, how would those results have been communicated to the White House, to the president?
I don't know how they were initially communicated. I do know that they came up in subsequent conversations with the president, and Dag Rose and I essentially told him, we looked into that, and it's just not true.
Okay, so he was informed.
I told the president myself that several times in several conversations, that these allegations about ballots being smuggled in a suitcase and run through the machine several times, it was not true. That we looked at the video, we interviewed the witnesses, it was not true.
Still stunning
Mr. Pack,
they did all that
after you
work.
left the U.S. Attorney's Office on January 4th, 2021, did the next U.S. Attorney there, I think Mr. Trump's personal pick, Bobby Christine, did he investigate any remaining claims of fraud? And if so, did he find any evidence that supported the president's claims of voter fraud?
It is my understanding that Mr. Christine continued any investigations that were pending at the time of my departure, but he was unable to find any evidence of fraud that affected the outcome of the election.
So after investigating the president's and Mr. Giuliani's claims about voter fraud in Georgia, is it your view today that there was no evidence of widespread fraud sufficient to undermine confidence in the outcome of the election in Georgia?
That is correct.
Thank you, Mr. Pack. And I want to thank you also for the service that you've given to our country. We appreciate that. Next, I'd like to turn to President Trump's false allegations about election integrity in Philadelphia. The Attorney General discussed these allegations at some length.
You know, the idea, the president has repeatedly suggested that there was some kind of outpouring of unexpected votes in inner city areas like Philadelphia as recently as January 13th when he walked off the NPR set. He was asked by the interviewer, what's your evidence of fraud? And he said more people voted in Philadelphia than there were voters. And that was absolute rubbish. The turnout in Philadelphia was in line with the state's turnout. And in fact, it was not as impressive as many suburban counties. And there was nothing strange about the Philadelphia turnout. It wasn't like there was all these unexpected votes.
Yeah, by the way, I was there in Philadelphia that day.
So
it was nothing unusual.
I think once
we
you
were trying to
actually look
support
at the
long
votes,
lines.
and then
They didn't exist.
There's an obvious explanation.
But maybe all the mail-in
for example,
ballots.
in Pennsylvania, Trump ran weaker than the Republican ticket generally. He ran weaker than two of the state candidates. He ran weaker than the congressional delegate,
all over
delegation running for federal Congress, and he ran weaker than the Republican.
But some people say that's proof.
I haven't looked at this
Right, that they
recently,
only
but he
changed the
generally
presidential
was
votes.
which is ridiculous.
a weak element on the Republican ticket. So that does not suggest that the election was stolen by fraud.
How about Pennsylvania and Bill McSwain? We were talking to the U.S. Attorney in Philadelphia about an alleged discrepancy between the number of absentee ballots issued and the number of ballots cast.
Right. So I that was one of the big ones for a period of time. I think that was raised at Gettysburg by Giuliani or something like that. But it kept on being repeated, and I found it annoying because it didn't seem that it was right. So I called McSwain, and he got back to me. He said, no, the problem is that Mastriano threw out this number, and what he did was he mixed apples and oranges. He took the number of applications for the Republican primary, and he compared it to the number of absentee votes cast in the general election. But once you actually go and look and compare apples to apples, there's no discrepancy at all. And, that's one of the, I think at some point I covered that with the president.
I mean, again, that
We
Bill
have
Barr
another
is going
witness
around doing
here,
this, watching the
today,
reports, watching
who has
the hearing.
detailed knowledge about the election
Do your job,
process
man.
in Philadelphia. Mr. Schmidt, at the time of the
Shouldn't be
2020
doing
presidential
Trump's
election,
bidding.
you were serving as the only Republican member of Philadelphia's three-member city commission, which is responsible for overseeing elections throughout the city. Is that correct?
That's correct, Congressperson.
So President Trump made numerous claims regarding fraudulent voting practices in Philadelphia, including the claim that dead people were voting. In fact, Mr. Giuliani told Pennsylvania state legislators that 8,000 dead people voted in Pennsylvania. You investigated those claims of voter fraud. Can you tell us what you found?
Not only was there not evidence of 8,000 dead voters voting in Pennsylvania, there wasn't evidence of 8. We took seriously every case that was referred to us, no matter how fantastical, no matter how absurd, and took every one of those seriously, including these.
As it turns out, even Mr. Trump's campaign lawyers knew that the dead voter claims weren't valid.
I guess the crooks in Philadelphia are disappointed in this. They only submitted 8,021 ballots from dead people, mail-in ballots for dead people. Probably easier for dead people to submit mail-in ballots than it is to vote in person.
Rudy was at this stage of his life and the same ability to manage things at this level or not. And obviously, I think Bernie Kerik publicly said it. They never proved the allegations that they were making, and they were trying to develop.
Mr. Schmidt, on November 11th, 2020, President Trump tweeted about you, saying, and here's a quote, "A guy named Al Schmidt, a Philadelphia commissioner and so-called Republican, or rhino, is being used big time by the fake news media to explain how honest things were with respect to the election in Philadelphia. He refuses to look at a mountain of corruption, dishonesty. We win." As a result of that tweet and the CNN interview you gave where you stated the dead voter claims in Pennsylvania were false, you and your staff were subjected to disturbing threats. Can you tell us about that?
The threats prior to that tweet, and on some level it feels almost silly to talk about a tweet, but we can really see the impact that they have, because prior to that, the threats were pretty general in nature. Corrupt election officials in Philadelphia are going to get what's coming to them. You're what the Second Amendment is for. You're walking into the lion's den, all sorts of things like that. After the president tweeted at me by name, calling me out the way that he did, the threats became much more specific, much more graphic, and included not just me by name, but included members of my family by name, their ages, our address, pictures of our home, just every bit of detail that you could imagine. That was what changed with that tweet.
Wow.
Behind me are redacted threats that you received, that you provided to the committee. Now, we redacted portions of the text to protect your family. Mr. Schmidt, I think I speak for all of my colleagues when I say we are deeply sorry for what you and your loved ones have been through. And I also want to thank you for your service to your country and for
Trump
standing up for
supporters
the rule of law.
are
I want to thank
vile
both Mr. Pack
to
and
those
Mr.
that they
Schmidt
turn their
for their
attention
service,
to. Doug,
their
we've both been on
testimony,
the receiving end of
and
that.
for standing up
I
for
can't
the
even
rule of law.
imagine, in some small way, I can't
Now, I'd like
imagine
to
what
turn
Al
to
Schmidt
another subject.
experienced. They're vile.
Yeah.
The courts in our
Jesus
country
said that you can tell the
provide a
validity
legitimate
of
venue for
a tree
campaigns to
based on its
challenge
fruit.
what they view as
You see the
irregular
fruit of
election practices.
Trumpism,
Now,
and it
courts have
is
the final say
horrible.
on how the law applies to those challenges. We have a renowned legal expert here to address the Trump campaign's activities in court. Mr. Ginsburg, you've spent your entire career representing Republicans in election-related litigation.
I haven't seen him in a
You
year.
served as the National Counsel on Republican presidential campaigns in 2000, in 2004, and in 2012. You played a key role in the 2000 Florida recount that led to the Supreme Court's decision in Bush v. Gore. You served as the co-chair of the Presidential Commission on Election Administration. I think it's fair to say you're the most prominent Republican lawyer
statement
who's
before
litigated
judgment
in
seat
the
of
election
his guilt
field.
for
Now, you've
bad behavior
analyzed
for
the Trump
20 plus years.
campaign's litigation pretty carefully. What's the normal process for post-election litigation? How is the Trump campaign's different from the kinds of post-election litigation you've been involved in and know about?
Zoe Lofgren
In
is
the normal
great.
course of things, any campaign on the night of the election and the days after will do a couple of different things. One is that they'll analyze precinct results to look for abnormalities in the results, and they'll send people to those precincts to ask more questions. Secondly, all campaigns will have poll watchers and poll workers and observers in the polling place. And so campaigns will talk to those people if they saw any irregularities that could cause problems in the election. Now, the Trump campaign talked pre-election about having 50,000 poll workers. So presumably, they did have eyes on the ground in all these places. And so in the normal course of things, a campaign will analyze the reports that come in. Trump campaign had a couple of basic problems, however. Number one, the 2020 election was not close. In 2000, that was 537 and close. In this election, the most narrow margin was 10,000 and something in Arizona, and you just don't make up those sorts of numbers in recounts. And when the claims of fraud and irregularities were made, you've heard very compelling testimony from Mr. Stepien, from Matt Morgan, from Alex Cannon about those claims and how they didn't believe them. And so that put the Trump campaign on sort of a process of bringing cases without the actual evidence that you have to have in which the process is designed to bring out.
So are you aware of any instance in which a court found the Trump campaign's fraud claims to be credible?
No, there was never that instance. In all the cases that were brought, and I've looked at the more than 60 that include more than 180 counts, and no, the simple fact is that the Trump campaign did not make its case.
The Select Committee has identified 62 post-election lawsuits filed by the Trump campaign and his allies between November 4th, 2020 and January 6th, 2021. Those cases resulted in 61 losses and only a single victory, which actually didn't affect the outcome for either candidate. Despite those 61 losses, President Trump and his allies claim that the courts refused to hear them out, and as a result, they never had their day in court. Mr. Ginsburg, what do you say about the claims that Mr. Trump wasn't given an opportunity to provide the evidence they had of voter fraud?
Glad
Did they
she's bringing
in
this
fact,
up.
did they have their day in court?
They did have their day in court. About half of those cases that you mentioned were dismissed at the procedural stage for a lack of standing. The proper people didn't bring the case, or there wasn't sufficient evidence and it got dismissed on a motion to dismiss. But in the other, there was discussion of the merits that was contained in the complaints. And in no instance did a court find that the charges of fraud were real. And it's also worth noting that even if the Trump campaign complained that it did not have its day in court, there have been post-election reviews in each of the 6 battleground states that could have made a difference. And those ranged from the somewhat farcical Cyber Ninjas case in Arizona to the Michigan Senate report that was mentioned earlier, hand recount in Georgia that Mr. Pack addressed. And in each one of those instances, there was no credible evidence of fraud produced by the Trump campaign or his supporters.
Thank you.
Wow.
You know, as
Well
Mr.
said.
Ginsburg has explained, there are no cases where the Trump campaign was able to convince a court that there was widespread fraud or irregularities in the 2020 election. Over and over, judges appointed by Democrats and Republicans alike directly refuted this false narrative. They called out the Trump campaign's lack of evidence for its claims, and the judges did that even in cases where they could have simply thrown out the lawsuit without writing a word. You can see behind me a few excerpts from the decisions in these 62 cases. The Trump campaign's lack of evidence was
like a word
criticized
cloud.
by judges across the political spectrum. In Pennsylvania, a Trump-appointed judge concluded, quote, "Charges require specific allegations and proof. We have neither here." Another Trump-appointed judge warned that if cases like these succeeded, quote, "Any disappointed loser in a presidential election able to hire a team of clever lawyers could flag claimed deviations from election results and cast doubt on election results." The list goes on and on. Allegations are called, quote, "an amalgamation of theories, conjecture, and speculation." In another, strained legal arguments without merit, unsupported by evidence, derived from wholly unreliable sources, a fundamental and obvious misreading of the Constitution. The rejection of President Trump's litigation efforts was overwhelming. 22 federal judges appointed by Republican presidents, including 10 appointed by President Trump himself, and at least 24 elected or appointed Republican state judges dismissed the president's claims. At least 11 lawyers have been referred for disciplinary proceedings due to bad faith and baseless efforts to undermine the outcome of the 2020 presidential election.
The criminal conspiracy
Rudy Giuliani
is never ending.
had his license to practice law suspended in New York. And just this week, a newly filed complaint will potentially make his suspension from practicing law in D.C. permanent. And as we've just heard from perhaps the most preeminent Republican election lawyer in recent history, the Trump campaign's unprecedented effort to overturn its election laws in court was a deeply damaging abuse of the judicial process. As stated by U.S. District Court Judge David Carter, this was, quote, "a coup in search of a legal theory." Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I want to thank our witnesses
welcome aboard,
for
tall,
joining
skinny
us today.
Kiwi.
The members of the Select Committee may have additional questions for today's witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. Without objection, members will be permitted 10 business days to submit statements.
Do any of them
for the
actually
record,
submit
including
questions to
opening
these
remarks
witnesses?
and additional
I don't know.
questions
That's a
for the
good question. Or
witnesses.
they might just to get
The
certain
second
things
panel of
in
witnesses is
the
now
legal record,
dismissed.
because they use these legal records for all manner of things. So that's an interesting question. Is how many of these actually come through? I was sitting here, kind of looking at the fashion and the hairstyles. Ben Ginsburg, not so much. And in 20 years, people are going to look back
Without
on this period of
objection,
time.
the chair recognizes
And
the
like,
gentleman
look at what they were wearing back then.
Lofgren for a closing statement.
I find it fascinating, especially this guy
Thank you,
sitting
Mr.
behind
Chairman.
Zoe Lofgren.
Now that we understand the litigation efforts by President
guy.
Trump and his allies, I'd like to present additional actions taken by the Trump campaign during this time. President Trump continued to push the stolen election narrative, even though he and his allies knew that their litigation efforts, making the same claim, had failed. It's worth pointing out that litigation generally does not continue past the safe harbor date of December 14th. But the fact that this litigation went on, well, that decision makes more sense when you consider the Trump campaign's fundraising tactics. Because if the litigation had stopped on December 14th, there would have been no fight to defend the election and no clear path to continue to raise millions of dollars. Mr. Chairman, at this time, I'd ask for unanimous consent to include in the record a video presentation describing how President Trump used the lies he told to raise millions of dollars from the American people. These fundraising schemes were also part of the effort to disseminate the false claims of election fraud.
Without objection, so
My name is Amanda Wick, and I'm Senior Investigative Counsel with the House Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol. Between Election Day and January 6th, the Trump campaign sent millions of fundraising emails to Trump supporters, sometimes as many as 25 a day. Wow. The emails claimed the, quote, left-wing mob was undermining the election, implored supporters to, quote, step up to protect the integrity of the election, and encouraged them to, quote, fight back. But as the Select Committee has demonstrated, the Trump campaign knew these claims of voter fraud were false, yet they continued to barrage small-dollar donors with emails, encouraging them to donate to something called the Official Election Defense Fund. The Select Committee discovered no such fund existed.
I don't believe there is actually a fund called the Election Defense Fund.
Is it fair to say the Election Defense Fund was another, I think we called it a marketing tactic? Yes. And tell us about these funds as marketing tactics.
Just a topic matter where money could potentially go to be, how money could potentially be used.
The claims that the election was stolen were so successful, President Trump and his allies raised $250 million, nearly $100 million in the first week after the election.
That's more than he earned as a
On November
businessman in
9th,
20 years.
2020, President Trump created a separate entity called the Save America PAC. Most of the money raised went to this newly created PAC, not to election-related litigation. The Select Committee discovered that the Save America PAC made millions of dollars of contributions to pro-Trump organizations, including $1 million to Trump Chief of Staff Mark Meadows' charitable foundation, $1 million to the America First Policy Institute, a conservative organization which employs several former Trump administration officials,
And who's on the payroll of these places?
$204,857 to the Trump Hotel Collection, and over $5 million to Event Strategies, Inc., the company that ran President Trump's January 6th rally on the Ellipse.
All of us here today do not want to see our election victory stolen by
$5 million they paid to that committee.
which is what they're doing.
The evidence developed by the Select Committee highlights how the Trump campaign aggressively pushed false election claims to fundraise, telling supporters it would be used to fight voter fraud that did not exist. The emails continued through January 6th,
It's almost like we need
even as
campaign
President
finance
Trump
reform.
spoke on the Ellipse.
Yeah, I mean, you just need more reforms in our campaign finance.
30 minutes after the last
Maybe
fundraising email was
publicly
sent,
financed
the Capitol was
elections,
breached.
so to get rid of all of this ridiculousness.
There you go. Got to stop the small dollar donations are killing this country.
I hate seeing that footage. Whew.
Every American is entitled and encouraged to participate in our electoral process. Political fundraising is part of that. Small dollar donors
Shouldn't be.
use scarce disposable income to support candidates and causes of their choosing, to make their voices heard. And those donors deserve the truth about what those funds will be used for. Throughout the committee's investigation, we found evidence that the Trump campaign and its surrogates misled donors as to where their funds would go and what they would be used for.
Now, that's something you could try to
Not only
prove.
was there the big lie, there was the big ripoff. Donors deserve to know where their funds are really going. They deserve better than what President Trump and his team did. Mr. Chairman, I yield
Big
back.
ripoff.
That was
Without
really
objection,
powerful
the chair
ending.
recognizes the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Cheney, for a closing statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I would like to thank all of our witnesses today. And I'd also like to, in particular, wish Mr. Stepien and his family all the best on the arrival of a new baby. Today's hearing, Mr. Chairman, was very narrowly focused. And in the coming days, you will see the committee move on to President Trump's broader planning for January 6th, including his plan to corrupt the Department of Justice and his detailed planning with lawyer John Eastman to pressure the Vice President, state legislatures, state officials, and others to overturn the election. Let me leave you today with one clip to preview what you will see in one of our hearings to come.
Oh, it's our
This is the
cliffhanger.
testimony of White
Next.
House lawyer
On
Eric Hirschman.
January 6th hearing.
John Eastman called Mr. Hirschman the day after January 6th.
Oh, I'm
and
so
here's how
excited
that
right now.
conversation went.
Remember when TV shows used to do this?
Yep. Oh.
I said to him, "Are you out of your effing mind?" Right? I said, I only want to hear two words coming out of your mouth from now on. Orderly transition.
Dun, 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 dun.
Thank you,
I
Mr.
need
Chairman. I yield
I
back.
need a dun, 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 dun somewhere.
At the conclusion of last week's hearing,
The next
we
episode
showed
is
you a
called
video of
Disorderly
rioters
Transition.
explaining why they had come to Washington on January 6th. It was because Donald Trump told them to be here. Today we heard about some of the lies Donald Trump embraced and amplified when it became clear he didn't have the numbers of votes to win the election. We heard about how officials at different levels of government explored claims of fraud and found no evidence. Yet the former president continued to repeat those false claims over and over again. Today, we'll end things where we did on Thursday, back on January 6th, hearing words of individuals who wanted to stop the transfer of power. We know they were there because of Donald Trump. Now we hear some of the things they believed. Without objection, I enter into the record a video presentation.
I know exactly what's going on right now. Fake election. They think they're gonna fucking cheat us out of our vote and put communist fucking Biden in office. It ain't fucking happening today, buddy. You voted?
Yes, sir.
How'd it go?
Voted early. It went well, except for the can't really trust the software. Dominion software all over it.
We voted, and right in the top right-hand corner of the Dominion voting machine that we used, there was a Wi-Fi symbol with 5 bars. So that most definitely connected to the internet, without a doubt. So they stole that from us twice. We're not doing it anymore. We're not taking it anymore. So we're standing
Yeah,
up.
it's
We're
not
here,
how Dominion voting
and
machines work. And
whatever
she didn't
happens,
vote on a
we're
Dominion
not
voting
laying down
machine.
again.
I'm from Pennsylvania. It didn't work. It absolutely worked. It didn't work. No. Trust the system. 200,000 people that weren't even registered voted. 430,000 votes disappeared from President Trump's tally. And you can't stand there and tell me that it worked.
I don't want to say that what we're doing is right. But if the election's being stolen, what is it going to take?
He's got COVID.
The chair requests those in the hearing room remain seated until the Capitol Police have escorted members from the room. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.
Well, there we go, Rob. All right.
Oh, boy.
Well, I thought that was a nice way to end it. I thought that was an appropriate finish there, to be able to say, hey, look, let's connect that all these things that were just said were actually said to voters, and voters felt, that they...
that was the rationale for their involvement in January 6th for going.
That's right.
Because they believed what Donald Trump told them. Now, the question becomes, Doug, were you convinced that Donald Trump himself believed that he lost the election?
Yeah, look, I think that Donald Trump truly removes information that doesn't comport with his view of the world.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this is the way people who are detached from reality view things. They don't think about, and I think it's true of Donald Trump. Donald Trump didn't think about what's true. He thought only about how he was cheated. This is what obsessive compulsive behavior does to someone, right? I mean, there are so many parts of the struggle that human beings have that are evident in Donald Trump's behavior. This is just classic dissociative, level of someone with just obsessing on things that are not provable. So what happens is someone doesn't cognitive dissonance, which is a sort of, catch-all word. When someone's experiencing that, like you're holding two things that you can't bring together in your mind, you don't make a conclusion. You just continue to obsess on certain things and you block everything else out. It's what made the man dangerous as a politician and the president. It's what I think allowed him to incite people to violence against our country, because he was so detached from reality. And so many of these people that were testifying today were part of his cast of characters that allowed that reality to remain true, which is something I find just increasingly shocking.
Yeah. I mean, just to recap, we had his campaign manager, we had a Fox News contributor, we had a Republican election official, we had a Republican election attorney. That Democrats are working the committee is working really hard to show that this is not just partisan in the things that they are saying. Doug, what are the big takeaways from today for you?
Well, I thought them laying out in detail how many people were telling Donald Trump that these allegations were not true was the biggest takeaway. That look, he should have known. There's a reasonable expectation that a person would know and believe these things. His own mental state, his dissociative state, his unwillingness to believe things that are stated to him is something he has demonstrated, by the way, all the way through. I mean, from how many people were at his inauguration to, his relationship with Kim Jong-un, just over and over and over. So many of us were paying attention to the kinds of what just seemed to be complete wackadoodle ideas that he was communicating. So he continued that action, and what they had to lay out today. And I think they have to be really careful not to try to say, here's what he did know, and need to say, here's what is reasonable to expect him to have acted upon. This is the information he should have been acting upon. That's a level of nuance, though, that normally you just put it into, oh, he knew, right? That's the most of us aren't dealing with some legal level of culpability question around Donald Trump, right? I mean, come on. You're just saying oh, come on, the guy knew. Look, think about anybody who's been deceived, in anything, a family secret, a relationship, infidelity, a business transaction, somebody who drives recklessly, any manner of things where someone's like, I really didn't think that was happening. Someone's like, well, what about this? And what about this? And what about this? Did you not know that? Yeah, I didn't, of course. But I concluded, well, all of that goes into one's state of mind. And this man's state of mind just was demonstrably not only 4 years as the president, but running up to it, that he's totally incapable of maintaining the control. To the point that I think cabinet members and people in Congress were thinking between this period of the election and the inauguration of Joe Biden, that Trump had become mentally unfit to continue to function as president, that the 25th Amendment was under serious deliberation by people in the cabinet, and including Mike Pompeo and the former Treasury Secretary and others, Betsy DeVos. They were really worried about it, this thing that I think you have to describe here. And that makes things even more complicated around this man, that he's so much more incapable of being president than we ever knew.
Yeah. But you know what, when you describe accurately someone putting the pieces together, like, what didn't you understand this piece of evidence and this piece of it, you didn't connect these dots. That is putting the burden of connecting those dots on, you know, the person who's involved in that. And you say, okay, well, for whatever reason, they weren't able to connect those dots and arrive at the right conclusion. That's true. But what we have here with Donald Trump and what the committee said today was that there were multiple people whose jobs it was to connect those dots. And they did. And they told him, this is the situation. And he was given factual evidence over and over and over again by multiple people in multiple different spheres in his universe, telling him, there's nothing here. You lost. And it wasn't just that he was blinded and failed to see the, you know, evidence. He was told the evidence specifically, and he rejected it because it didn't fit his narrative.
Right. I think he intentionally, out of both in the moment and a pattern of behavior, dismisses any information that doesn't fit his worldview.
Yes.
I just truly believe this is the mental state of the man till this very day, which makes him so recklessly dangerous. Yeah. The same thing when he stood in Helsinki next to Vladimir Putin and said, I know that our professionals in the CIA are telling me that he interfered in the election. They're telling me that in the 2016 election. But he told me that he didn't. And why would he have? Okay, over and over, the man took in information, said, I hear what you're saying, and yet I'm going to draw this other conclusion. This is habitual. I'm not saying it lets him off the hook.
Right.
I'm saying that his behavior is not, it is more detrimental to the country than simply he's just a liar and all the rest. He is a liar. He is a true born deceived liar is what we're dealing with here.
Yeah.
It really, in my view, is something profoundly more dangerous to the well-being of this country.
Yeah. Yeah. I think for me, you know, one of the, I found really compelling and really interesting what Zoe Lofgren had to say, Congresswoman Lofgren had to say in her closing statements about the grift that was happening. It wasn't just that Donald Trump believed he won, believed he got screwed, and was, you know, fighting on the side of justice and goodness. It wasn't just that he was trying to hold on to power. His team, and listen, when we say him, we mean not just him, but we mean all of the people around him. You know, it was interesting I mentioned Gaslit, this TV show about Watergate, and there's a scene where there are several people who are involved in Watergate who are in prison, and John Dean and Chuck Colson and several others, and there's a billboard of Nixon that they're doing work digging out some, you know, tree trunk as a part of their you know, community service, their hard labor.
Okay.
And they're under this billboard. And John Dean points to the billboard and he says, "We were Nixon." He said, "That is an old man. That's a shadow. We were Nixon. All of us were Nixon." And I feel that way with Donald Trump, that all of these people were Donald Trump. These people were Trump. And the people that wrote the emails that fleeced the American public out of millions of dollars, they're responsible too. Donald Trump didn't write those emails. There's staffers, there's people that consistently go along with this lie. And they are Donald Trump too. They are responsible too. And the grift involved with these folks is just stunning.
And continues to this day. Hundreds of millions of dollars that they have. The reason the Republicans won't move against Trump is because he has amassed from those fundraising emails, and he combined the Republican National Committee fundraising side to his own organization. So he's sitting on hundreds of millions of dollars to spend. That's why Republicans, especially in the House, won't move against Trump and won't say anything against him, because they'll be cut off from those funds. Because when you raise so much money in small donations that match all the rules, but it's so much money, that system of continuing to lie to people. I mean, look, we have a problem with campaign funding in this country. And we tried to say that you can't have huge donors funding everything without that having some limits and being exposed. And the idea that small donations coming from 1 million or 5 million or 10 million people is somehow going to protect. What it means is you have to deceive not one big donor, you have to deceive 10 million people. The Trump administration and the Trump campaign were never two entities. It was always one. And they went on a consistent effort to deceive people as a part of their fundraising grift. That's what they've been doing. And look, it's really a problem. And I think a lot of those people who sent those checks to this committee, I think they'd be glad that they did. I think they honestly don't care that Trump was told things that weren't true. I think that a lot of people still just believe this stuff hand over fist. And look, Trump has been saying over and over for decades that our elections are fraudulent. He doesn't trust democracy in America. That's the guy that says, I don't trust democracy in America. Ran for president, won the presidency, and functioned as president, continuously saying, I think our entire system is rigged. That's stunning. It is I know for some people, they're like, the greatest thing you can do is to tell America that our elections are rigged. It's not. It is insulting to the American people, is insulting to our democratic system. It's insulting to the political apparatus that's worked on so hard by so many people all around the country. And the Trumpist side, which you saw in those people at the cutout at the end where people were saying, why am I here? Those people thought elections were rigged from the very beginning. They thought all politicians are bought off, and they just think, politics in this country is just bought and sold and it's all rigged. And that attitude, I'm telling you, we let that creep around and live unchallenged because somehow, I don't know, you're better off, you're more authentic if you tell people that our elections are rigged.
Well,
absolutely horrible.
There's consequences to our political rhetoric, and we've got to be careful about it. Like there's lots of rhetoric about I'll stay in the fight and I'll fight for you and revolution and there's frankly both sides. I hate to be about like whataboutism, and I'm not drawing some moral equivalency comparison between groups here. What I'm simply doing is making an observation that both sides has engaged in hyperbolic rhetoric for the purpose of fundraising, and it has consequences.
Yes.
And
it works to raise money, and it also works to poison people's minds about what our politics really are.
So Wednesday is episode 3 of As the Committee Hearings Turn. This is the IMDb episode preview, according to the LA Times. This is their what to expect. This is what it says. And the last sentence has me excited.
Ooh.
So here we go. The third hearing is expected to show how Trump pressured the Justice Department to claim there had been rampant fraud in the election, as well as his attempt to install an attorney general who would help him get that done. Trump's efforts were blocked by Justice Department leadership and by White House lawyers who threatened to resign. Here we go. You ready? Several Republican lawmakers were involved in Trump's effort.
Wow. And you think it's those lawmakers, that's what gets you excited. You believe that someone's going to name the names of the lawmakers who participated in that effort to try to pressure the Justice Department.
I think we're going to find that there was a number of times throughout this process that Team Trump included elected members of Congress. And, if we find out that there's been rumors that they gave tours to the people who committed the insurrection on January 6th and invaded the Capitol building, we're gonna find out.
Yeah, and specifically Matt Gaetz gave tours, right? I mean, I've heard that. I've heard that allegation too, and I think it's provable.
We're gonna several Republican lawmakers were involved in Trump's effort. Now, I think that's significant because, there is a tradition of faux friendship that exists within our Congress. That they will talk in glowing terms about one another, and at the same time there is also real legitimate friendship that exists between lawmakers, and they get this sense of they do get to know one another on a personal level that causes them to pull their punches in a way that a political commentator on a MSNBC or Fox News might not. The idea that these Congress people are going to go after their colleagues, that's big. That's big. It's big.
There's an agreed upon decorum in that world that you don't do that.
And the thing that would prompt them to do it would be the overwhelming evidence of the horrific wrongdoing that was done by these members of Congress. So I'm excited for Wednesday.
Yeah,
Doug, we're going to do this again on Wednesday morning?
We're going to do it again on Wednesday. We're going to plan to start at 9 a.m. Central because that's what time the committee says they're going to have their hearing. So we expect that they will. And if they don't, they're going to, we're going to deliver an earful. We're going to deliver a microphone full, whether it's an earful to them. I'm quite certain it won't be. But we will not be dissuaded from doing our part. We'll show up on time.
Yeah, exactly.
That'll be at our tombstone. Vote Common Good. Showed up on time.
We'll also show up on time tomorrow with our regular Common Good politics.
Yeah,
podcast.
it's not just 3-hour live streams for us around here. We also do 1-hour live streams around here. Right back here. Share with your friends. Tell people you know. Hit a like button, subscribe, all that stuff.
Can I give a little preview of tomorrow? A couple of things. Number one,
please.
We'll have round 2 of our candidates for Common Good. We're going to be announced, which is pretty exciting. Excellent. And we have one of our candidates for Common Good who's going to be joining us and talking about her race for Congress. So it's going to be in a very important competitive congressional district.
Yeah. I feel like we need to add something. I don't know. There's something in the act of people in Congress to not go down the path. There have been a lot of times in elections that when it comes to the certification of the presidential electors that people vote against them. That's what that's the apparatus that the Trump supporters and the insurrectionist supporters used. But you go back to every presidential election and there's people who did that, right?
Yeah.
And everybody's like, well, the reason they couldn't, didn't cause a problem is because a House member has to get somebody in the Senate, and the Senate's going to be reasonable. So even if you get a House member that's going to, object to the electors, you're not going to get anybody in the Senate because they're really, they're not just fluff over there at the Senate. They're serious politicians. Well, this time, they're just as fluff as the rest of them. We just have to stop that stuff altogether, right? All this election being rigged stuff. Let's take that like pulling a fire alarm and not take it like just typical campaign rhetoric. Like let's now, after an insurrection, take this more seriously. So I feel like somewhere in what every candidate who's running, we should ask them like, hey, voter suppression's a big deal. Election fraud's a big deal. Will you commit to not using that as just a talking point to sort of gin people up? Because there's a lot of that goes on too, right?
Yep.
Absolutely. I still have friends that don't believe that Donald Trump officially won the election in 2016. They believe that Russia changed votes, right? So this stuff just continues to go on, and I think it's just really, really harmful. And we can't have it going unchallenged because you build a culture in which people just say the whole thing is fake and rigged and all the rest. I don't know.
Yeah.
We can be better with our rhetoric and with our language.
Absolutely.
All right, is that good? Or should we just keep talking and let me see how long we've been talking? How long we've been going? You see, 2 hours and 55 minutes. So let's get it done before we hit the 3-hour mark. All right, thanks everybody. Thanks Alex. Thanks Jim. Thanks Tall Skinny Kiwi. Thanks Brandon. Thanks Kathy. Thanks James, for all of you that were contributing here. If you're still watching, we really do appreciate it. And we'll see you tomorrow. Bye.